What if I told you Arthur Conan Doyle wrote a mystery so forgot that most fans of Sherlock Holmes have never heard of it, yet it may be one of his most suspenseful hidden stories? Tonight, we uncover the contest. No one in the village of Blackthorn Hollow ever forgot the scream that rang out from the bell tower at precisely 7 minutes past 9 on the evening of the harvest contest, because by the time the church bells began to toll above it, old Gregory Pym was already dead. Rain had only just begun to tap against the slate rooftops when Miss Eleanor Whitmore looked up from her teacup, her hand freezing halfway to her lips as the cry split the twilight like torn silk. Around her, the warm chatter of the village hall stumbled into stunned silence. Forks paused in midair, glasses clinked sharply against saucers, and somewhere near the raffle table Mrs. Dobson gave a startled gasp and dropped an entire tray of seed cakes onto the floor. "What in heaven's name was that?" whispered Reverend Pike, his face draining of color beneath his spectacles. But Eleanor was already moving. She stood so abruptly her chair scraped across the wooden floorboards, drawing every eye in the room. At 34, Eleanor Whitmore was not officially anything so grand as a detective, though many in Blackthorn Hollow suspected she secretly considered herself one. Tall, neat, and forever dressed in dark wool skirts with sensible boots, she had the unnerving habit of noticing things others preferred remained unnoticed. Her gray eyes missed little. Her mind missed nothing. "That came from the church," she said sharply, setting down her cup. "Stay here. Eleanor, don't be absurd," called her younger sister Margaret, but Eleanor was already at the door, yanking on her coat as the wind rushed inside. Outside, the village square glistened wet beneath the gas lamps, puddles reflecting golden halos into the black evening. The crooked stone church stood at the hill's crest, looming above the cottages like some ancient watchman. Another scream rose from its direction, shorter this time, strangled, followed by frantic shouting. By the time Eleanor reached the iron gate, half the village had gathered there, crowding beneath umbrellas and lanterns. Someone was sobbing, someone else was muttering prayers. She pushed through the throng and stopped. At the foot of the church bell tower, sprawled crookedly upon the rain-slick flagstones with his limbs bent at impossible angles, lay Gregory Pym, dead. His white contest sash, embroidered only that afternoon with the words "Harvest Champion," was soaked crimson across the chest. For one terrible moment no one moved. Then Mrs. Penworthy fainted with a moan. "Oh, dear God," breathed the vicar, clutching at the gate. Eleanor stepped closer, kneeling carefully despite the mud. Gregory's round spectacles had shattered beside his face. His silver hair clung wetly to his forehead. Blood trickled from a wound at the back of his skull, though Eleanor saw at once that the fall itself was not what had killed him. Something slender protruded from between his ribs, a knife, not kitchen-made, not common, ornate, decorative, and buried to the hilt. "He was stabbed before he fell," Eleanor said quietly. Constable Wilkes, panting from his run across the square, arrived then and bent over the body with a groan. "Lord preserve us," the villagers began whispering all at once. "Murder! Who'd do such a thing? Not Gregory, he never harmed a soul," but Eleanor's eyes had lifted upward. The bell tower door stood open, swinging gently. She stared at it, then at the stone steps leading inside. Wet footprints trailed down them, fresh. Someone had been up there, and someone had come down. The constable was blustering now, trying to move everyone back, but Eleanor was already climbing the steps. "Miss Whitmore," he barked. "You can't just—" "I absolutely can," she snapped, vanishing into the stairwell. The inside of the bell tower smelled of wet stone, dust, and old wood. Eleanor climbed the spiral staircase 2 steps at a time, her breath echoing in the narrow shaft. At the top, wind howled through the arched openings. Rain sprayed across the floorboards. And there beside the great bronze bell stood a single overturned chair. Nothing else. No murderer, no witness. Only the chair swaying slightly in the wind. Eleanor crouched beside it, touching the wood, still warm. Whoever had stood there had left mere moments ago. Her gaze drifted to the sill of the open bell window and her stomach tightened. Scuffed marks marred the stone ledge, as though someone had been dragged or forced toward it. Gregory had not jumped. He had been thrown. A floorboard creaked behind her. Eleanor spun sharply, but it was only Thomas Bellamy standing in the stairwell, chest heaving. Young, handsome, with rain-dark curls plastered to his brow and his usual charming grin entirely absent. "Christ, Eleanor," he breathed, pressing a hand to the wall. "You shouldn't be up here alone." "Neither should you," she said. His eyes flicked toward the window, then to the chair. Do you think someone pushed him? I know they did. Thomas swallowed hard. Gregory had enemies then. Elinor stared at him. Thomas Bellamy was a solicitor's son, newly returned from London 6 months prior, and generally considered the most eligible bachelor in 3 counties. But now his voice shook in a way Elinor had never heard before. Why would you say that? She asked softly. He hesitated, then looked away. No reason, which, of course, meant every reason. By midnight, the whole village buzzed like a kicked hornet's nest. Gregory Pym, judge of the annual harvest contest and owner of Pym's Curiosities, had been murdered during the most beloved event of the year. Police from the neighboring town would arrive by morning, but until then Constable Wilkes stationed himself outside the church with all the confidence of a man deeply aware he had no idea what he was doing. Elinor, naturally, ignored his instructions to go home. Instead, she stood beneath the dripping awning of Gregory's little curiosity shop, staring through the rain-speckled window at shelves of porcelain figurines, clocks, odd brass trinkets, and yellowed maps. Gregory had lived alone above the shop for 20 years. No wife, no children, no known relations. And yet, as Elinor watched, she noticed something strange. The upstairs curtain twitched, her breath caught, then the candlelight vanished. Someone was inside. She hurried to the door and rattled it. Locked. She knocked hard. Hello. Nothing. She knocked again, louder, still silence. Then very faintly, a floorboard creaked overhead. Someone was moving around in Gregory's rooms. Elinor's heart pounded. She stepped back, scanning the alley, there a narrow side gate. She darted through it, skirts catching on ivy, boots splashing through mud until she reached the rear staircase climbing to Gregory's flat. The door at the top stood ajar. Very slowly, she pushed it open. The apartment beyond was dark except for moonlight leaking through clouds. Dust floated in silver beams. The air smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and lavender polish. Hello, Elinor whispered. Silence, then a sudden crash upstairs. She bolted toward the noise, into Gregory's bedroom, just in time to see a shadow leap through the open window. Stop, she shouted. She lunged forward, but the figure vanished into darkness below. Breathing hard, Elinor leaned out the window, seeing only rain-soaked hedges swaying below. Whoever it was had escaped, but not before leaving something behind. On the floor near the desk lay a torn scrap of black velvet, and beside it an envelope, already opened. Inside was a single handwritten note, 3 words, "He knows everything." Elinor stared at it, cold spreading down her spine. A voice suddenly spoke behind her. "Well," said Margaret faintly from the doorway, holding a candle and looking utterly horrified, "I should very much like to know why my sister is standing in a murdered man's bedroom in the middle of the night." Elinor nearly screamed. "Margaret," her sister pressed a hand dramatically to her chest. "Honestly, you're the one sneaking about like a lunatic. I followed you from the square." "What is that?" Elinor showed her the note. Margaret's face paled. "Good Lord." "And someone was just here looking for it," Elinor whispered. "For what?" Elinor's eyes drifted to Gregory's desk. Papers had been thrown everywhere, drawers yanked out, books torn from shelves. "They were searching for something Gregory had hidden," she said quietly. "And whatever it was, someone killed him to keep it secret." Margaret shivered. "Perhaps we should let the police handle this." Elinor bent and picked up the scrap of velvet, black, fine quality, torn from a coat or cloak. Her eyes narrowed. "There were only 3 people wearing black velvet tonight," she murmured. Margaret blinked. "Mrs. Penworthy, Miss Hartley, and Dr. Edmund Crowe," Elinor finished. At the sound of his name, both women fell silent. Dr. Crowe was Blackthorn Hollow's physician, elegant, intelligent, silver-tongued, and so handsome the women of the village became flustered in his mere presence. He was also, Elinor had privately always thought, just a little too smooth. Margaret frowned. "Surely not Dr. Crowe." "Why not?" "Because he's well," she coughed awkwardly. "A doctor." Elinor gave her a look. "Doctors murder people all the time in books. That is not reassuring." A knock thundered below. Both women jumped. "Miss Whitmore," barked Constable Wilkes from downstairs. "If you're trespassing in this crime scene again, I swear on my mother's grave." But Elinor was no longer listening, because on Gregory's bedside table sat something she had not noticed before, a photograph. Framed in silver, Gregory, much younger, standing beside 3 others. One was unmistakably Dr. Crowe. One was Thomas Bellamy's father, and the third, Elinor's breath caught, her own father. She stared, pulse thundering. Her father had died 15 years ago. He had never once mentioned Gregory Pym, never once, yet here they stood smiling arm in arm like lifelong friends. On the back of the photograph, written in fading ink, were the words, "The Four Founders." "May no one ever learn what we did." Margaret read it over her shoulder and let out a tiny, frightened gasp. "Oh, Eleanor." Below them, the constable pounded harder on the door, but Eleanor barely heard him, because in that moment she knew Gregory's murder was not about the harvest contest. Not really. The contest had only been the excuse, the distraction. Whatever Gregory knew, whatever terrible secret tied together her father, Gregory, Bellamy's father, and Dr. Crow, had remained buried for 15 years, until tonight, and now one of them was dead. Someone had broken into his home, someone was hunting evidence, and someone, Eleanor suspected with icy certainty, was about to realize she had found it first. A floorboard creaked behind them, much closer than before. Margaret's face went white. Very slowly, both sisters turned toward the darkened hallway just beyond the bedroom door, where a tall figure now stood perfectly still in the shadows, watching them breathe. Margaret let out a strangled yelp, the candle in her hand trembling so violently wax splashed over her fingers, and Eleanor, her own heart slamming painfully against her ribs, snatched the nearest thing within reach, a brass fire poker from beside Gregory's hearth, and held it up with both hands. "Who's there?" she demanded, though her voice came out thinner than she intended. The figure stepped forward into the amber glow, and Thomas Bellamy raised both hands at once. "Good Lord, don't strike me, Eleanor." Margaret sagged against the wall with a breathless groan. "You insufferable man," Thomas blinked, genuinely startled. "Why are you two in Gregory's rooms?" Eleanor narrowed her eyes, not lowering the poker. "That was precisely what I intended to ask you." Rainwater dripped from the hem of Thomas's coat onto the floorboards. His face looked pale beneath the candlelight, strained in a way that transformed his usually easy features into something older, more troubled. He glanced from the poker to the photograph in Eleanor's hand, and the color drained from him so quickly it was almost theatrical. "Oh no," he whispered. "You recognize it," said Eleanor sharply. Thomas swallowed. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he shut the bedroom door behind him and lowered his voice. "You shouldn't have found that." Margaret gave a tiny squeak. "That is an extremely suspicious thing to say." Thomas scrubbed a hand over his face, visibly fighting panic. "Listen to me carefully. If you found anything else, letters, journals, documents, anything at all, you need to give them to me. Right now." Eleanor tightened her grip on the poker. "Absolutely not." "Eleanor, no. Gregory is dead. Someone broke in here looking for something, and now you appear in the middle of the night demanding evidence. Start explaining, Thomas, or I shall hit you with this poker so hard your grandchildren will feel it." He stared at her for one long second. Then, rather absurdly, he gave the faintest breath of a laugh. "You would too. Try me." Thomas exhaled shakily. "My father told me something before he died last winter." "Not everything, mind you, God knows." He was maddeningly vague, but enough. He nodded toward the photograph. "Those men weren't merely friends. They founded Blackthorn Hollow's investment trust 15 years ago. The village fund, the one that rebuilt the schoolhouse, restored the church roof, paid for the war memorial." Eleanor frowned. "Everyone knows that." "Yes," Thomas said grimly, "but the money didn't come from donations." Silence. Rain battered against the windows. Margaret blinked. "Then where did it come from?" Thomas looked toward the floor, his jaw tight. "It was stolen." The room seemed to freeze. "What?" Eleanor whispered. "Not from the village," Thomas said quickly. "From a man named Rupert Ashcombe, a landowner from London. My father claimed Ashcombe came here in 1911 intending to purchase nearly half the surrounding farmland and drive every tenant farmer out if they refused his prices. Gregory, your father, mine, and Crow." He swallowed. "They learned he carried bearer bonds worth thousands. They lured him here during the autumn fair. My father never said exactly what happened, only that Ashcombe disappeared that night and his fortune vanished with him. No one ever found the body." Margaret clapped a hand over her mouth. Eleanor stared at him, horrified. "You're saying our fathers murdered a man?" "I don't know," Thomas snapped, then lowered his voice immediately. "Sighs, I don't know, but I know they used the money afterward to save the village. Quietly, secretly, my father swore it was for the greater good. And Gregory knew all this. He was the only one left alive who knew everything." Eleanor's thoughts raced so quickly they made her dizzy. "Then someone killed him because they feared he would reveal it." Thomas nodded grimly. "But why now?" Margaret whispered. A silence settled, and then Eleanor's eyes widened. The contest, she said. Thomas frowned. What? The harvest contest? Elinor turned sharply. Gregory announced earlier tonight he intended to make a most surprising declaration before naming the winner, didn't he? Margaret nodded slowly. Yes, he meant to confess something. Elinor's voice lowered. Or expose someone. Thomas's expression darkened. Then whoever killed him believed Gregory was about to speak. Below them came another thunderous bang from the front door. Miss Whitmore, Constable Wilkes sounded on the verge of apoplexy. Margaret winced. We cannot keep ignoring him forever. No, Elinor murmured. We can't. She looked again at the photograph, at the words scribbled behind it. May no one ever learn what we did, and suddenly something struck her. Thomas, she said slowly, if your father told you all this, why were you at the bell tower tonight? He froze. Margaret turned to stare at him. Thomas's face hardened. Because Gregory sent me a letter yesterday. He said he wanted to meet privately after the contest. Said he had something urgent to discuss about my father. Elinor stepped closer. And when I met him at the tower, Thomas swallowed hard. He was already arguing with someone. With who? I couldn't see. The stairwell was dark. I heard raised voices, Gregory shouting, you can't hide it forever. And then his throat bobbed. Then I heard him scream. By the time I reached the top, whoever was there shoved past me and ran down the stairs. I only saw a glimpse. Elinor's breath caught. Thomas hesitated, then whispered, a woman. Margaret blinked. A woman. She wore a dark cloak, veil over her face, but she was definitely a woman. Elinor and Margaret exchanged a look. Mrs. Penworthy, Miss Hartley, or someone else entirely. Why didn't you tell the constable? Elinor demanded. Thomas barked a bitter laugh. And explain why I was secretly meeting the murdered man in a bell tower at night. I'd be arrested before breakfast. Fair point, Margaret muttered. Another knock below. Thomas looked toward the door. You need to hide that photograph. If the police find it. No, Elinor said firmly. If the murderer learns we have it, we become targets. Margaret made a distressed sound. Wonderful. They descended together at last to let in a furious Constable Wilkes, whose mustache twitched with righteous indignation at the sight of all three of them in Gregory's flat. He spent several breathless minutes demanding explanations, which Elinor avoided with masterful vagueness before the local doctor, Dr. Edmund Crowe himself, arrived to assist. And the moment he entered the room, Elinor saw it. His coat, black velvet, her stomach twisted. Dr. Crowe removed his gloves with practiced elegance, silver eyes cool and unreadable beneath dark lashes. Miss Whitmore, he said smoothly, I might have guessed I'd find you at the center of things. Elinor folded her arms. Doctor, his gaze swept over Thomas and Margaret. Quite the gathering. Constable Wilkes harumphed. Doctor, I've asked them repeatedly not to tamper with the crime scene. Yes, yes, Crowe murmured, barely listening. Then his eyes landed on the torn velvet scrap still in Elinor's hand, and for the briefest fraction of a second his expression changed. Barely, but enough, shock, then gone. His smile returned instantly. What have you there? Elinor slowly tucked the scrap into her pocket. Nothing important. His gaze held hers. Something cold passed between them. Then he smiled wider. Do be careful, Miss Whitmore. Curiosity has a way of leading people into dreadful trouble. Margaret shivered visibly. Thomas stiffened beside her, and Elinor, staring into Dr. Crowe's polished, handsome face, felt an icy certainty settle deep in her bones. He knew she suspected him. And in his eyes, behind all the charm and gentility, she glimpsed something that made her blood run cold: fear. The next morning Blackthorn Hollow awoke beneath a blanket of fog so thick it swallowed the rooftops whole. No one spoke of anything but Gregory Pym. Curtains twitched in every window. Groups gathered whispering at corners. Even the butcher sliced ham in near silence, leaning over his counter to mutter theories to anyone who'd listen. By 10 o'clock, Inspector Harold Fenwick from Market Weatherby had arrived, a broad man with a magnificent walrus mustache and the exhausted expression of someone perpetually inconvenienced by humanity. He immediately took charge of the investigation, and equally immediately informed Elinor in no uncertain terms that her assistance was not required. Naturally, she ignored him. By noon, she sat in the Rose and teacup with Margaret and Thomas, stirring untouched tea while replaying every detail. Suppose Crowe did it, Margaret whispered. Why? Thomas leaned in. Perhaps Gregory meant to expose him specifically. Or perhaps Crowe feared Gregory would reveal the old crime and destroy all their reputations, Elinor said. But Gregory was involved too. Exactly, Alina frowned, which means something changed. Something made Gregory decide after 15 years to talk. A sudden voice interrupted from behind them. "Perhaps guilt," said Miss Violet Hartley. All three jumped. The village schoolmistress stood at their table, clutching her gloves. Thin, stern, and always dressed in severe lavender, Violet Hartley had the unsettling habit of appearing silently whenever gossip was brewing. She sat down uninvited. "I couldn't help overhearing," she said primly. Margaret groaned. "Of course not." Miss Hartley leaned close. "Gregory came to me last week." Alina nearly spilled her tea. "What?" He asked if I believed wicked deeds ever truly stay buried. Miss Hartley sniffed. I assumed he was being philosophical. Now I wonder otherwise. Alina's pulse quickened. "Did he say anything else?" Miss Hartley hesitated, then nodded slowly. "He said, one of us means to betray the others before winter comes." Thomas went pale. "One of us," Alina repeated softly, meaning Gregory believed one of the remaining founders or their families was involved, and then another thought struck her. "Where is Rupert Ashcombe buried?" she asked suddenly. Thomas blinked. "Buried. If he died here, where is the body?" No one answered. A terrible silence followed. Then Margaret whispered, "Oh God," because every single one of them had thought the same thing. There was only one place in Blackthorn Hollow old enough, secret enough, and untouched enough to hide a body for 15 years, the abandoned well in Briarwood. And at that exact moment the bell above the tea-room door jingled. Everyone turned. Dr. Crow stood in the entrance, immaculate as ever, raindrops gleaming on his coat. His eyes met Alina's, and though he smiled, he looked furious. For one long, breathless moment no one at the table moved. Dr. Crow stood in the doorway with rain shining on his shoulders and fog curling in behind him like smoke, his polished boots dark with wet earth, his black velvet coat buttoned neatly to the throat. His expression wore that same easy, civilized smile he always carried, as if he had merely strolled in for tea and polite conversation. But his eyes, fixed squarely on Alina, burned with something far less pleasant. "Miss Whitmore," he said pleasantly, removing his gloves finger by finger. "What a surprise." Alina set down her teacup very carefully. "Doctor," Margaret muttered under her breath, "I rather wish everyone would stop greeting each other like duelists." Miss Hartley gave a nervous cough. Crow crossed the room with unhurried elegance, every head in the tea-room subtly turning to watch him. The entire village was already on edge. People had become so desperate for scandal they could likely smell tension from 50 paces. He stopped beside their table, smiling down at them. "Thomas," he said smoothly. "Miss Hartley, Margaret." Then looking back to Alina, "May I?" "No," said Alina at once. He blinked, then chuckled softly and sat anyway. "Well," he murmured, folding his hands, "I see your manners remain as sharp as ever." "What do you want?" Alina asked. Crow tilted his head. "How direct. I merely wish to offer condolences. Gregory's death has shaken us all." Thomas stared at him flatly. "Has it?" Crow's eyes slid toward him. "You seem tense, Mr. Bellamy, and you seem overly calm for a man whose old friend was murdered." Margaret kicked Thomas sharply under the table. He winced. "Ow, damn it." Crow laughed lightly, but the sound rang hollow. "Well, we all grieve differently." Alina leaned forward. "Where were you last night between 9 and 10, doctor?" Silence dropped around the table. Crow looked at her with amusement. "Am I being interrogated?" "Yes." Miss Hartley made a small choking noise. Crow's smile widened faintly. "At home, reading, alone unfortunately, so no one can verify it." "How convenient," Thomas muttered. Crow ignored him. "And may I ask why you're so interested?" Alina held his gaze. "Because Gregory was murdered with a decorative knife. The kind collectors keep. The kind you admire." Crow's eyes flickered, only briefly. Then he laughed. "Surely half the village owns decorative knives. Not many own Persian ivory-handled daggers." That stopped him. Margaret stared at Alina. "How do you know it was Persian?" Alina did not look away from Crow. "Because Dr. Crow showed one off at the Midsummer Fair 3 years ago and talked about it for 20 minutes. Miss Hartley whispered, "Good heavens." Crow's jaw tightened almost invisibly. "Are you accusing me of murder over a knife collection?" "No," Alina said softly. "Not yet." He leaned closer then, voice dropping, smile never wavering. "Careful, Alina. False accusations can be very dangerous." The way he said her name made Margaret visibly stiffen. Alina stared right back. "So can murder." The tea-room had gone nearly silent around them. Then Crow stood abruptly, smoothing his coat. "Well," he said lightly, "I do hope the police catch whoever did it. Until then, perhaps it would be wise for everyone to stop indulging in wild speculation. He looked at Alina one final time, before someone gets hurt, and then he turned and walked out into the fog. Only once he was gone did anyone breathe. Margaret whispered, "Well, that was deeply unpleasant." Thomas nodded grimly. "He knows we suspect him." "No," Alina murmured, watching the door. "He knows we know something." Miss Hartley leaned in. "Then if you're going to Briarwood, I assume you're not foolish enough to go alone," Margaret groaned. "We're apparently going to Briarwood now." "We must," Alina said. "If Ashcombe's body is there, it proves everything." "And if Crow suspects where we're going?" Thomas asked. Alina stood. "Then we go before he can stop us." Briarwood sat a mile beyond the village, a thick twisting patch of ancient woodland locals avoided after dusk thanks to decades of superstition, ghost stories, and one memorable incident involving drunken boys and stolen church robes. The fog followed them all the way there, drifting pale and ghost-like between black tree trunks. Leaves crunched damp beneath their boots. Branches clawed overhead in the wind. Margaret clutched Alina's arm tightly. "I hate this. I hate every part of this." "You complain remarkably well for someone who insisted on coming. Because if I stayed home alone, I'd die of nerves." Thomas walked ahead carrying a lantern, its beam trembling over roots and stones. Miss Hartley followed behind with surprising determination for someone shaped vaguely like a broomstick. "There," Thomas whispered suddenly. Ahead, half swallowed by thorn and ivy, stood the old stone well. It rose crooked from the earth like some forgotten monument, ancient moss covering its rim, its wooden cover long since rotted away. The air around it felt colder somehow. Margaret stopped dead. "No, absolutely not." Alina stepped closer, peering into darkness. She could see nothing below but endless black. Thomas lifted the lantern over the opening. Its light vanished downward. "Dear God," Miss Hartley whispered. Alina knelt at the edge, then frowned. "There's rope here, fresh rope. Looped around the side post. Still damp." Thomas swore quietly. "Someone's been here recently." Before anyone could speak, a twig snapped behind them. All four spun. Nothing, only fog and trees. Margaret whispered, "Did you hear that?" Then another snap. Closer. Thomas lowered the lantern. "Who's there?" Silence. Then suddenly a figure burst from the fog, masked in black. Thomas shouted, "DOWN." The figure lunged, shoving him hard into the well's stone rim. The lantern flew from his hand, smashing against a rock and plunging the clearing into near darkness. Margaret screamed. Alina threw herself at the attacker, grabbing fabric, hearing the sharp rip of cloth as they struggled wildly. The masked figure elbowed her hard in the ribs. She gasped, stumbling backward, and Thomas tackled the person from the side with a furious roar. They crashed to the ground. Miss Hartley shrieked, "I've got them." "Oh no, I don't." The figure kicked violently, striking Thomas in the stomach. Groaned, and then the attacker tore free and sprinted into the trees. "Stop!" Alina shouted, chasing after them blindly. Branches whipped her face. Mud slid beneath her boots. She caught one fleeting glimpse of black cloak vanishing through fog, then her foot struck something hard. She crashed forward with a cry, sprawling face first into wet leaves. By the time she scrambled up, the figure was gone. Panting, bruised, Alina looked down at what had tripped her. A shovel, fresh dirt clung to its blade. Her stomach turned. Back at the well, Thomas was pale and wheezing but upright. "Did you see who it was?" "No," Alina said breathlessly, "but they were waiting for us." Miss Hartley pointed shakily. The rope, they all turned. The rope dangling over the well now swung slowly, as if something had recently been lowered or raised. Thomas swallowed hard. "Someone got here before us." Together, grim and silent, they hauled on the rope. It resisted, heavy, terribly heavy. Margaret whimpered, "Oh God." Hand over hand they pulled until finally something emerged from the blackness below. Not a body, a wooden chest, old, iron-bound, mud-caked. Thomas hauled it over the rim with a grunt. Everyone stared. A lock hung broken from the latch. Someone had already forced it open. Alina lifted the lid slowly. Inside lay stacks of old papers, ledgers, letters, documents tied in ribbon, and on top a revolver. Miss Hartley gasped. Beneath it sat a leather journal. Gregory's handwriting covered the front. Alina opened it. Her eyes flew over the page, then widened in horror. Thomas grabbed her arm. "What?" She looked up slowly, voice barely above a whisper. "It was Ashcombe they killed." Silence. "What?" Margaret breathed. Alina turned the journal toward them, finger trembling over the first line. Thomas read aloud, his voice faltering. If this journal is found, then God forgive me, because the man buried beneath Briar Well is not Rupert Ashcombe, but Henry Whitmore." Everything stopped. Margaret's face went white. Thomas stared in disbelief. Miss Hartley gasped so sharply she nearly choked. And Eleanor could not breathe, could not think. Her father, no, hands shaking violently, she turned pages. More frantic entries, Gregory's confessions, half-scrawled, desperate. Thomas read over her shoulder, voice cracking. "Ashcombe blackmailed us all. Henry tried to confess. Crow struck first. Bellamy helped hide the body. We swore never to speak of it again." Margaret let out a broken sob. Eleanor stumbled backward as though struck. Her father hadn't been one of the conspirators. He had been the victim. Murdered, buried, by the very men she had grown up calling family friends. And Gregory had known for 15 years. Tears stung Eleanor's eyes as rage, grief, and horror crashed through her in one overwhelming wave. Thomas whispered, pale as death, "My father helped kill your father." No one moved. Then from somewhere deep in the fog behind them, a voice said calmly, "Yes." Every spine snapped rigid. Dr. Crow stepped from the mist holding a pistol, and he was smiling no longer. The sight of him standing there in the fog, coat black against the pale mist, pistol steady in his hand, his handsome face stripped at last of every trace of charm, froze the blood in Eleanor's veins so completely she could scarcely breathe. No one moved. Even the wind seemed to hush. Dr. Crow stepped closer, boots crunching softly over wet leaves, his silver eyes reflecting the faint moonlight with a brightness that looked almost feverish. "Well," he said quietly, almost conversationally, "this has become inconvenient." Margaret gave a small, strangled whimper. Thomas instinctively moved in front of Eleanor, though he looked white as paper. "Crow, oh don't," Crow sighed, the pistol never wavering. "Don't do that noble thing men do when they know perfectly well they're useless in a fight." "Step aside, Thomas." "No," Crow's expression hardened. "I said step aside." Eleanor's mind raced desperately, but all thought seemed fractured by the thunder of her pulse in her ears. Her father, Henry Whitmore, buried beneath the earth like refuse for 15 years while everyone lied to her face, while Crow smiled at her in the street, while Bellamy's father tipped his hat at church, while Gregory drank tea in her mother's parlor and spoke fondly of old times. Her stomach twisted violently. "You killed him," she whispered. Crow's gaze shifted to her, and for one flickering second something almost like regret crossed his face. "Yes," he said softly. Margaret gasped aloud. Eleanor stared, trembling. "Why?" Crow let out a long breath through his nose, lowering his head slightly as though burdened by memory. "Because your father was weak," Thomas barked. "You bastard." Crow raised the pistol sharply. "Quiet." Thomas froze. Crow looked back to Eleanor. "Your father had no stomach for what needed doing. Ashcombe came to Blackthorn Hollow intent on destroying every family in this village, forcing widows and farmers into the road, buying their homes for pennies and turning the land over to factories. We had one chance to stop him. One." His jaw tightened. Henry agreed, we all agreed. "But he changed his mind," Eleanor whispered, tears burning her eyes. "Yes." Crow's face darkened. "At the last moment. After it was done, after Ashcombe was dead and the money secured, Henry decided he'd developed a conscience." Crow laughed bitterly. "He wanted to confess, wanted to hand us all over and return the money to London. Fool, sentimental fool." "So you murdered him," Eleanor said, voice shaking with fury. Crow stepped closer. "We begged him not to force our hand." Gregory wept. Bellamy vomited, but Henry would not listen. He looked almost irritated now, as if recalling an inconvenience rather than a murder. "He gave us no choice." "No choice." Eleanor's voice cracked into something almost feral. "You buried my father in a well." Crow's eyes flashed. "We saved this village." His shout rang through the trees. "We built every blessed stone of it with that money. The school, the infirmary, the church roof, everything your precious father wanted to throw away." He pointed the gun wildly toward the village in the distance. "All of it exists because we did what had to be done." "And Gregory?" Thomas demanded. "Why kill him now?" Crow's face went cold. "Because Gregory lost his nerve too." Silence. "He came to me 3 nights ago," Crow said, "babbling about guilt, damnation, old sins. Said he intended to confess everything at the harvest contest. Said he'd written it all down in case anything happened to him." He gestured toward the journal in Eleanor's hand. "I searched his house but couldn't find it. Then I realized he must have hidden it here. And when he threatened to expose you," Eleanor whispered. Crow nodded once. "I silenced him." Miss Hartley made a choking sound behind them. Crow turned the gun slightly toward her. You lot should never have meddled. Thomas tensed. Alina saw it, saw his shoulders shift just slightly, his weight moved to 1 foot. She inhaled sharply. Thomas, no, but he was already moving. With a furious shout, Thomas lunged. The gun exploded. Margaret screamed. The sound tore through the woods like thunder. Thomas crashed into Crow, and both men slammed to the ground, wrestling wildly in the mud. The pistol flew from Crow's hand, vanishing into leaves. Alina shouted and dove for it. A hand grabbed her ankle. Crow, he yanked hard. She shrieked, crashing down into the dirt. Crow released Thomas and seized Alina by the throat, slamming her against the ground with shocking force. You meddling little, she gasped, clawing at his wrists, vision blurring. Then suddenly whack. Miss Hartley, with a noise somewhere between a shriek and a war cry, brought the shovel down across the back of Crow's skull. Crow groaned and collapsed sideways. Everyone froze. Miss Hartley stood panting, both hands gripping the shovel, her bun half fallen loose and eyes wide with shock. Oh dear, she whispered faintly. I hit him rather hard. Thomas coughed violently, rolling over in the mud. Remind me never to cross you. Margaret was sobbing hysterically. Is everyone alive? Is anyone shot? Thomas, are you shot? Alina, are you dying? I'm fine, Alina wheezed, clutching her throat. Then they all stared at Crow. He lay unconscious in the leaves, blood trickling from his temple, breathing shallowly. Thomas slowly sat up. Well, Miss Hartley blinked. Should we tie him? Yes, Alina croaked. Oh good. They bound him with the rope from the well and marched him, half dragged, half carried, back toward the village just as dawn's first weak light began bleeding into the sky. The entire village erupted when they arrived. People poured from houses in dressing gowns and coats, gasping and shouting at the sight of Dr. Crow, muddy, bloodied and trussed like a criminal hog. Constable Wilkes nearly fainted where he stood. What in God's name? He murdered Gregory Pym, Alina rasped. And my father. The silence that followed was absolute. By mid-morning, Inspector Fenwick had Crow in irons, Gregory's journal in evidence, and half the village gathered outside the station whispering in horrified disbelief. When the remains beneath Briar Well were recovered later that day, the watch Henry Whitmore had worn the night he vanished still clung to the bones. Margaret wept when she saw it. So did Alina. Crow confessed by sunset, coldly, neatly, without remorse. Bellamy's father, long dead by then, was posthumously disgraced. Gregory Pym's name became forever tangled in scandal, and Blackthorn Hollow, the tidy, perfect village built on stolen money and blood, was never quite the same again. Yet the strangest part, Alina thought in the days that followed, was how quickly people returned to ordinary life. By week's end, Mrs. Dobson still gossiped at the Butcher S. Children still raced through puddles outside the schoolhouse. The church bells still rang each morning. Only now, every time they tolled, Alina thought of Gregory's scream. 3 evenings after the arrest, she stood alone in the churchyard at dusk, mist curling low over the graves, staring down at the fresh stone newly placed beside her mother. Henry Whitmore at last returned home. She touched the carving lightly, tears pricking her eyes. A voice behind her said gently, "Thought I'd find you here." She turned. Thomas stood with hands in his coat pockets, face bruised purple from the fight but smiling faintly. Alina sniffed. "You look dreadful." He chuckled softly. "You're not exactly radiant yourself." For a while they stood in silence. Then Thomas said quietly, "I'm sorry for what my father did." Alina looked at him. He meant it, every word. She nodded slowly. "I know." Thomas hesitated. "I understand if you never wish to see me again." And despite everything, despite grief, despite anger, despite exhaustion, Alina gave the faintest laugh. "Oh, Thomas," she said, voice thick with emotion. "After all this, I should think you're rather impossible to get rid of." He smiled. And just as he opened his mouth to answer, a scream tore across the village square. Both their heads snapped up. Another scream followed, then shouting, and the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. Thomas and Alina stared at each other in alarm. Then without a word both turned and ran, down through the fog, toward the square. Toward whatever fresh horror now waited in the gathering dark, because standing outside Pym's curiosity shop, screaming so hard she could barely breathe, was Mrs. Penworthy, pointing with trembling finger toward the upstairs window, where framed behind the glass, though Gregory Pym had been buried 2 days earlier, a man's pale face was staring out from the darkness. For one impossible, frozen second, the entire square seemed to stop breathing. Mrs. Penworthy stood in the middle of the cobblestones, bonnet crooked, one gloved hand pressed to her chest, while the other shook violently toward the upper window of Gregory Pym's shuttered shop. "There," she shrieked again, voice breaking. "There, oh Lord save us, he's looking at me." A crowd was already gathering, drawn by the screams like moths to candlelight. Doors flew open. Lamps lit behind curtains. Villagers stumbled half-dressed into the evening fog, murmuring in alarm, and every face turned upward. Toward the upstairs window, toward the pale, unmistakable face staring out from behind the curtain. Margaret, rushing up behind Alina and Thomas, let out a shrill gasp so loud it might have woken the dead itself. "Oh, sweet merciful heaven!" Then the face vanished. The curtain dropped, and the upstairs light went out. The square erupted. "Gregory's ghost. He's alive. No, no, I saw him buried myself." Alina was already running. Thomas. He sprinted beside her, both of them shoving through the panicking villagers toward the front door of the shop. Constable Wilkes, who seemed cursed by God to always arrive precisely 1 minute too late to every disaster, came barreling around the corner wheezing violently. "What now? What now? Must someone die every night in this village?" "Open it," Alina shouted. "It's locked." Thomas didn't hesitate. He stepped back and kicked the door so hard the wood splintered inward with a crack like thunder. Margaret squeaked, "Well, that seems illegal." They rushed inside. The shop smelled of dust, old paper, and stale lavender polish. Shadows loomed long and strange between shelves of clocks and trinkets. Somewhere upstairs a floorboard creaked. Alina's heart jumped into her throat. "There," Thomas hissed. The sound came again, soft, measured, deliberate. Someone was moving above them. They tore up the narrow staircase, Alina nearly slipping in her haste, and burst into Gregory's apartment, empty, cold. Silent, the bedroom door stood open. The curtains billowed inward in the wind, and the window was wide open. Thomas swore under his breath and rushed to it, leaning out. No one below. Alina scanned the room wildly. No sign of the figure, no footprints, nothing disturbed. Then Margaret whispered from behind them, voice trembling, Alina." Alina turned. Margaret stood beside Gregory's writing desk, staring downward with horror. There, laid neatly atop the polished wood as though placed moments ago, rested a sealed envelope, addressed in spidery black ink to Miss Alina Whitmore. A chill crawled down Alina's spine. Very slowly she stepped forward. "No," Thomas said sharply. "Don't touch it," but she already had. The paper felt dry, old somehow. Her fingers shook as she broke the seal. Inside was a single folded sheet. She opened it. "Read," and every drop of blood drained from her face. "What is it?" Thomas whispered. He swallowed, then read aloud. "If you wish to know the whole truth about your father, come alone to Blackwood Manor at midnight. Tell no one. You have buried the wrong man." Silence. Margaret stared. "What?" Thomas blinked. "That's impossible." Alina read it again, slower, disbelieving. "You have buried the wrong man." "No," she whispered. "No," Thomas agreed immediately. "Absolutely not. This is madness." Margaret nodded frantically. "Yes, exactly. Wonderful point. Let's burn that note and move abroad." But Alina's pulse hammered. Wrong man. No, they had found Henry's watch, Gregory's confession, bones in the well, hadn't they? Unless someone wanted her to doubt, or worse, unless someone knew something they didn't. "Blackwood Manor," Thomas muttered darkly. "That place has been abandoned for 20 years. Alina looked up sharply. "Who owned it?" Thomas hesitated, then, "Rupert Ashcombe." The room went still. Margaret whispered, "Oh no." Blackwood Manor sat on the hill beyond Briar Wood, its windows dark and broken, its great iron gates rusting shut since Ashcombe's disappearance 15 years earlier. Children dared one another to throw stones at it, but never after sunset. Villagers crossed themselves when passing its road, and now someone wanted Alina there, alone, at midnight. "No," Thomas said firmly, "you're not going. I have to. You absolutely do not. They know something. They may know how to murder you." "Thomas, no," he snapped, stepping closer. "Have you not nearly died enough this week?" His voice echoed off the walls. Margaret blinked. Constable Wilkes coughed awkwardly from the doorway. Even Miss Hartley, hovering nervously downstairs, looked scandalized. Thomas lowered his voice, breathing hard. "You are not going alone." The note had explicitly said come alone, which meant, Alina reasoned grimly, she almost certainly wouldn't. Midnight came cloaked in rain, naturally. Because apparently Blackthorn Hollow had decided all life-changing revelations must now occur in miserable weather. Alina trudged through wet grass beneath a black cloak, lantern in hand, boots slick with mud as Blackwood Manor loomed ahead through the storm. The house rose from the hill like a dead thing, tall, crooked, all shattered windows and ivy-choked stone. Its once grand facade had rotted into ruin, gargoyles worn smooth by rain and time. Thunder rolled overhead, and Alina, despite herself, shivered. She mounted the cracked front steps, pushed open the great door. It groaned inward. Inside smelled of rot, mildew, and old wood. "Hello," she called softly. Only silence answered. Behind her, hidden in darkness among hedges where they had promised to wait, Thomas, Margaret, and Constable Wilkes watched unseen. Hopefully, Alina stepped deeper inside. Her lantern cast strange shadows across peeling wallpaper and ruined portraits. A staircase curved upward into darkness. Rain tapped through holes in the ceiling. Then a voice drifted from somewhere deeper inside. "Miss Whitmore," male, soft, weak. Alina spun. "Who's there?" A figure stepped from the dining room shadows, and Alina nearly dropped the lantern. The man was gaunt, pale, bearded, older than she remembered, but no, her knees nearly gave out. "Father," Henry Whitmore stood before her. Alive, she stared, unable to breathe. His face was thinner, lined deeply with age and suffering, but unmistakable. The same eyes. The same mouth, the same gentle brow. Tears sprang instantly to Alina's eyes. "No," he looked at her with agony. "Alina," she made a broken sound, half sob, half gasp, and stumbled toward him. He caught her in trembling arms, and Alina collapsed against him, crying so hard she could scarcely stand. No, you were dead. They said you were dead." "I know," he whispered hoarsely, tears in his own voice. "I know, my darling girl." She clung to him, shaking violently. How are you here?" He pulled back, hands trembling on her shoulders. "There's no time. You must listen carefully. The bones in the well aren't mine." Her whole body went cold. "What?" "Ashcombe S," he said. "They buried Ashcombe there, but Crow lied in the journal, changed parts before Gregory hid it. Gregory meant to reveal everything, but feared no one would believe him." Alina stared, mind spinning. "But you were murdered." Henry's face twisted. "They tried." He swallowed hard. "That night 15 years ago, Crow and Bellamy struck me when I refused to help cover Ashcombe's death. I fell, hit my head. I thought I would die, but Gregory stopped them from finishing it. He begged them to spare me." His voice shook. "They buried Ashcombe in the well and locked me here in the manor cellar until they decided what to do." Alina could barely process the words. "They kept you prisoner for weeks. Gregory secretly helped me escape, gave me money. Sent me abroad before Crow could find me." Tears brimmed in his eyes. "He said if the village believed me dead, you and your mother would be safe." Alina's heart shattered. "All these years," she whispered. "I watched from afar. I wanted to return so many times." His voice cracked. "But Gregory begged me not to. Said Crow watched everything. Said if Crow learned I lived, he'd kill us all." Alina wept openly now, shaking with grief and joy and rage. Then suddenly a slow clap echoed through the hall. Both froze. A figure stepped from the shadows. Dr. Crow, bruised, battered, bandaged, but free, and smiling. "Oh," he said softly, "what a touching reunion." Alina's blood turned to ice. Behind him stepped two more men, large strangers in dark coats. Constable Wilkes had failed, or been stopped. Henry shoved Alina behind him. "Run," Crow laughed. "Honestly, Henry, did you really think I wouldn't anticipate sentimentality?" Alina's eyes widened. "How did you get free?" Crow tilted his head. "Inspector Fenwick is less difficult to bribe than one might hope." Thunder cracked overhead. Crow drew another pistol. "I truly had hoped to avoid more unpleasantness," he sighed, "but you people simply refused to stay dead." Henry shoved Alina backward. "G.O." Gunfire exploded. Glass shattered. Alina screamed, and Henry jerked violently before collapsing to his knees. "Father!" He hit the floor, blood spreading fast across his shirt. No. Crow stepped forward calmly, gun smoking. "How exhausting this family has become." Alina dropped beside Henry, sobbing, pressing shaking hands to his wound. Henry coughed blood, eyes fluttering. "Run, no, run, Alina." She looked up. Crow was raising the gun again, then suddenly from the doorway came a furious roar. Thomas Bellamy launched himself at Crow like a madman. Margaret screamed. Wilkes shouted. The whole room exploded into chaos, and somewhere in the madness, as men fought and glass shattered and thunder shook the manor walls, Henry Whitmore grabbed Alina's wrist weakly, pulled her close, and whispered one final breathless sentence into her ear, something so shocking, so impossible, that Alina froze in absolute disbelief before his eyes rolled back and his hand fell limp. your mother knew." The words were barely more than breath against her ear, ragged and wet with blood, but they struck Alina harder than the gunshot. She stared at him. "What?" she whispered, but Henry's fingers slipped from her wrist. His head lolled sideways, and he went still. For one terrible second Alina could do nothing but stare, kneeling in spreading blood while the world around her blurred into noise and motion. Margaret screaming, Thomas grunting in fury, furniture splintering, Crow shouting curses somewhere beyond the ringing in her ears. Then grief turned instantly, violently into rage. She rose, not gracefully, not calmly. She rose like something possessed. With a cry that tore raw from her throat, Alina seized the nearest object at hand, a shattered leg from an overturned chair, and hurled herself at Dr. Crow. He had Thomas half-pinned against the wall, the pistol skidding loose beneath the dining table as the two men struggled savagely. Crow turned too late. The chair leg cracked across the side of his skull. He staggered with a roar. Alina swung again and again. "You killed him," she screamed. "You killed him." Crow stumbled backward, blood streaming from his temple, eyes wild now with fury and disbelief. "You little bitch," Thomas slammed into him full force. Both men crashed through the rotten banister of the staircase with a deafening crack. Wood exploded. The floor gave way beneath them, and with twin screams both vanished into darkness below. Silence. Then a horrific crunch. The entire room froze. Margaret's sobbing stopped dead. Constable Wilkes, breathless and bruised from grappling with one of Crow's hired men, turned white as chalk. No one moved. Then slowly, carefully, Alina stepped to the shattered hole in the floor and looked down. Below in the collapsed cellar, amid broken beams and rubble, two bodies lay tangled. Thomas groaned. Crow did not. Blood pooled black beneath his broken neck. Margaret whispered faintly, "Oh dear God." "Thomas," Alina cried. She scrambled down broken beams into the cellar, nearly slipping in dust and splintered wood, and dropped beside him. He blinked up at her, dazed face streaked with blood and plaster. He coughed. "Did we win?" A hysterical laugh burst from her through tears. "You idiot." He gave the faintest weak grin. "That sounds promising." Upstairs, Wilkes and Margaret secured the remaining men while Alina clung to Thomas with shaking hands, half laughing, half sobbing, relief crashing through her so hard she thought she might faint. But then her eyes lifted. The cellar. Her breath caught, because beneath the fallen beams, half revealed where the floorboards had collapsed, stood an old iron door built into the stone foundation wall. Hidden, rusty, bolted, long concealed behind what had once been the staircase. And suddenly Henry's words rang through her head. "Your mother knew." Her whole body went cold. "What is it?" Thomas asked weakly. Alina stood slowly, staring at the door. "Something else is here." The cellar smelled of dust, rot, and old secrets. Constable Wilkes protested weakly that perhaps they should wait for daylight and proper officers and several stronger men and possibly a priest, but Alina ignored him entirely. Together, lantern in hand, they forced the rusted bolt. The hidden door groaned inward, and behind it, a narrow stone passage. Leading deeper beneath the manor, Margaret whimpered, "No, no, absolutely not. There cannot be a secret tunnel now, I refuse." But there was. The passage twisted underground, damp and narrow, until it opened into a small, concealed chamber. A room, no bigger than a pantry. Inside stood a desk, a cot, shelves, candles burned low, recently lit, and stacked neatly against the wall dozens of letters, boxes, ledgers, newspapers, evidence. Henry had lived here, recently, for days, weeks. Perhaps longer. He was hiding here, Thomas murmured. "No," Alina whispered. Her eyes drifted to the desk. A framed photograph sat there, of Henry, and beside him her mother. Margaret sucked in breath. "Oh my God. No, 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 no." Hands trembling, Alina picked up one of the letters, opened it, recognized instantly the handwriting, her mother's. She read aloud in a whisper, "My dearest Henry, Alina grows more beautiful each year. She misses you terribly, though she believes you gone. Forgive me for keeping your secret. I pray every day this lie protects her." Alina swayed. Thomas caught her elbow. "Steady." She knew, Alina whispered blankly. She knew he was alive. Margaret covered her mouth. Letter after letter, years of them, her mother had known, had helped hide him, had lied every day of Alina's life, protected him, protected the secret, protected the village perhaps, or feared Crow too much to do otherwise. Alina sank slowly onto the cot, staring at the letters in numb disbelief. "All those years," she whispered, She let me mourn him, knowing. Tears slid silently down her face. Thomas crouched before her carefully. Eleanor, she lied to me. His voice softened. Perhaps she thought it was the only way to keep you safe. She lied. Eleanor cried suddenly, grief breaking through her voice. Everyone lied. My father, my mother, Gregory, all of them, every single person lied to me while I lived in that house, asking why my father left, and no one told me the truth. Her voice cracked. Margaret knelt beside her, crying too now. Oh, Ellie, and Eleanor broke. She wept harder than she had at the grave, harder than when Henry died in her arms, because now grief had become something uglier, crueler, betrayal. By dawn, Blackwood Manor swarmed with police. Crow's body was recovered, his men arrested. Inspector Fenwick looked so overwhelmed by events he seemed on the verge of resigning from civilized life entirely. Blackthorn Hollow woke the next morning to yet another scandal, but this one was worse, much worse, because now the truth spread fully. Rupert Ashcombe had died in an altercation with Gregory and the others. Henry Whitmore had survived attempted murder. Crow had manipulated the cover-up for 15 years. Henry had lived hidden while his wife helped conceal him. Gregory had died trying to confess, and Crow had murdered anyone who threatened the truth. The village nearly imploded with gossip. Mrs. Dobson cried in the butcher's. Mrs. Penworthy fainted again. Miss Hartley became temporarily famous after word spread she had struck a murderer with a shovel, and Eleanor did not leave her room for 2 days. On the third evening there came a knock. She opened the door to find Thomas, still bruised, arm in sling, holding flowers that looked deeply apologetic for existing. I thought perhaps, he said awkwardly. Well, flowers seem customary after trauma. Despite herself, Eleanor laughed through her exhaustion. He smiled. There she is. He stepped inside. For a while they sat in quiet. Then Thomas said softly, I know you're angry. I'm everything, Eleanor whispered. He nodded. After a silence, he added, your mother loved you. Eleanor stared down at her hands. I know. She made terrible choices, perhaps. But fear makes cowards of people. Another silence. Then Thomas cleared his throat awkwardly. I also realize this is perhaps dreadful timing, given the murders and emotional devastation and all, but nearly dying twice has given me a certain perspective. Eleanor blinked at him. He swallowed hard, then blurted, I'm in love with you. Silence. Margaret, listening shamelessly outside the door, audibly choked. Thomas winced. I know, terribly timed. I just thought if I died again it would be embarrassing not to mention. Eleanor kissed him. Hard, he made a startled noise into her mouth, then kissed her back at once. Outside the door Margaret shrieked. I knew it. They burst apart laughing despite themselves. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Eleanor felt warmth break through the darkness. Weeks passed. Blackthorn Hollow slowly healed. Henry was buried properly, beside her mother, together at last. Crow's name became cursed. Gregory's grave remained strangely crowded with flowers from villagers who pitied his guilt, and life somehow staggered forward, until one crisp autumn evening, nearly a month later, Eleanor and Thomas walked together through the square beneath lantern light when she paused, frowning. What is it? Thomas asked. She stared toward the church. At the bell tower, someone stood at the top window, watching them, a silhouette, tall, still, her stomach dropped. Thomas, he turned. The figure vanished. Without thinking, both ran toward the church. The tower door stood open, swinging gently. Eleanor's heart thundered. No one uses this after dark. They climbed the spiral steps fast, bursting into the bell chamber empty. No one there, only wind, only shadows, and a single object resting atop the overturned chair where Gregory had died. An envelope, freshly placed, addressed in familiar black ink, to Miss Eleanor Whitmore. Thomas whispered, no. Hands shaking, Eleanor opened it. Inside, you were wrong about one thing. Crow did not act alone. If you want the final truth, come to the graveyard at midnight. Bring no one. And beneath the message, a signature. Not a name, just 2 chilling words, the fourth. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The bell above their heads swayed faintly in the wind, groaning low and hollow like some sleeping beast disturbed in its dreams. And Eleanor stood frozen with the letter in her hand, while the blood drained so swiftly from her face she thought she might faint where she stood. Thomas read the note again over her shoulder, his voice barely above a whisper. Crow did not act alone. That's impossible, he said immediately after, though the certainty in his tone sounded forced even to him. Crow confessed everything. No, Eleanor murmured, staring at the ink. He confessed what we asked him about. That is not the same thing. Thomas took the paper from her and held it closer to the lantern light. The handwriting, her stomach twisted. It's the same, she whispered, as the others. Black ink, the same spidery hand, the same deliberate slant, not Crow's elegant script, not Gregory's hurried scrawl. Someone else had written every anonymous note. Someone who had been watching all along. Thomas swallowed hard. We are absolutely not going to the graveyard. We have to. No, Thomas, absolutely not. He spun toward her, face pale. The last time you followed one of these invitations, your father was shot and a manor collapsed. That is a fair criticism, she admitted. Thank you, but I'm still going. He groaned, dragging a hand down his face. You are impossible. And yet, she said softly, folding the letter, you keep following me. He stared at her. Then, despite everything, gave a grim little laugh. Yes, God help me, I do. Midnight came sharp and bitter cold. Fog crawled low between the gravestones, silver beneath the moonlight, and every branch in the churchyard rattled softly in the wind like bones knocking together. The old yew tree near the gate swayed and creaked overhead, its long black limbs stretching over the graves like reaching fingers. Elinor hated it immediately. I despise this, Margaret whispered beside her, clutching a lantern so tightly her knuckles gleamed white. I wish to be perfectly clear that I despise every second of this. You weren't invited, Elinor muttered, and yet you think I'd let you come alone after everything. Not likely. Thomas walked ahead, jaw set, carrying a walking stick in one hand with the grim determination of a man fully prepared to beat a ghost if required. Constable Wilkes followed behind them, muttering under his breath about pensions and early retirement. They had, naturally, ignored the note's instruction to bring no one. Elinor approached the Whitmore family plot first, her boots crunching softly over gravel. Moonlight gleamed against the fresh stone of her father's grave. Nothing, no one, only silence. Thomas turned slowly, scanning the darkness. Whoever sent it may be watching. As if in answer, a voice drifted from the shadows behind the mausoleum. You never could follow directions, Miss Whitmore. All four spun. A woman stepped slowly into the moonlight, and Margaret gasped so sharply she nearly swallowed her tongue. No, Elinor whispered. Mrs. Penworthy smiled. Sweet little Mrs. Agnes Penworthy, round-cheeked, silver-haired, always smelling of lavender and biscuits, forever fainting at excitement and fussing over everyone's hems, stood before them in her neat wool coat and sensible boots, holding a revolver with perfectly steady hands. No trembling, no panic, no harmless fluttering fussiness, just cold composure. Thomas stared in disbelief. You, Mrs. Penworthy gave a small shrug. I confess I rather enjoyed the ghost business. Dramatic, don't you think? Margaret made a strangled noise. You fainted. Oh, that, Mrs. Penworthy waved a dismissive hand. Performance, dear. I was in amateur theater for years. Elinor's mind spun so violently she could barely speak. You're the fourth, Mrs. Penworthy inclined her head. At last, silence crashed over the graveyard. No, Thomas said. No, that's absurd. You're 70. 62, she corrected sharply. And age has never prevented wickedness, Mr. Bellamy. Elinor stared at her. You were involved with my father, with Gregory, with Crow. Mrs. Penworthy smiled faintly. Not quite. I was Rupert Ashcombe's secretary. The world seemed to tilt. What? Elinor whispered. Mrs. Penworthy stepped closer, revolver glinting in moonlight. My name is not Agnes Penworthy. It is Agnes Ashcombe, Margaret gasped. Ashcombe. Yes, her pleasant face twisted into something darker. Rupert was my brother. Silence. Elinor felt her stomach drop. Mrs. Penworthy's voice sharpened. When he vanished, everyone believed he ran off to France with some dancer, but I knew better. Rupert adored his money far too much to leave it behind. Her eyes glittered. I came here looking for answers, and I found them. Thomas whispered, horrified. You learned what happened. Oh yes, she smiled thinly. Eventually. Gregory drank too much one winter and said too much to the wrong ears. Then I knew what those men had done. You blackmailed them, Elinor breathed. Mrs. Penworthy laughed softly. Naturally, memories flashed through Elinor's mind. Mrs. Penworthy always present, always listening, always near the gossip, always knowing everything. All these years, Elinor whispered. For 15 delightful years, Agnes said. Crow paid me handsomely to keep quiet. Bellamy did too before he died. Gregory less willingly, but guilt makes men wonderfully obedient. Thomas looked sick. You extorted my father, oh, repeatedly. And Crow, Elinor asked. Why turn against him now? Mrs. Penworthy's smile vanished. Because Edmund Crowe became greedy. Her eyes darkened. He wanted rid of me. He meant to flee with what remained of the money after Gregory's death and leave me with nothing after all these years. She spat lightly. Ungrateful creature. So you exposed him. I nudged events, yes. The notes, the sightings, the manipulations. It had all been her. You set everything in motion, Elinor whispered. Agnes smiled. I merely arranged for truths to emerge. Thomas stepped forward. Why bring us here? Her expression changed then, something colder, sharper. Because, my dears, you have become a complication. Every muscle in Elinor's body tensed. Agnes lifted the revolver higher. Crowe is dead. Gregory is dead. Bellamy and Rupert are long buried. Henry too at last. She sighed softly. But you know far too much now, and I cannot spend my remaining years worrying you'll connect every loose end. Wilkes squeaked. Now hold on, she fired. The shot cracked through the graveyard. Wilkes screamed and dropped flat, though the bullet shattered only the angel statue beside him. Everyone moved at once. Thomas lunged. Margaret shrieked. Elinor dove sideways as Agnes fired again. The bullet whistled past her shoulder. Thomas tackled Agnes hard around the waist, both crashing into the gravel. The gun flew spinning through moonlight and vanished among graves. Margaret shouted, "Get it, get it, get it!" Elinor scrambled wildly through the stones, hands scraping dirt until her fingers struck metal. A hand seized her wrist. Agnes. Faster than seemed possible, the older woman had torn free of Thomas and thrown herself at Elinor with startling strength. You meddlesome little witch! She slammed Elinor backward against a headstone. Pain exploded through her skull. Stars burst in her vision. Agnes clawed for the revolver. Thomas grabbed her coat. Margaret shrieked and hit Agnes with her lantern. Wilkes somehow tangled himself in a wreath and fell over entirely. Chaos erupted. Then Agnes ripped free and ran straight toward the church. After her, Elinor shouted. They sprinted across the churchyard, boots pounding stone, Agnes surprisingly swift ahead of them despite her age. She darted through the chapel doors and vanished inside. The church swallowed them in darkness. Pews loomed long and black beneath moonlit-stained glass. Agnes, Elinor shouted. Stop! No answer. Then a door slammed above, the bell tower. No, Thomas groaned. Not the bloody tower again. They rushed for the spiral stairs. Up, up, breathless, panting, the bells groaning overhead in the wind. Then Elinor burst into the bell chamber and froze. Agnes stood at the open window, hair wild, chest heaving, the revolver trembling in one hand, in the other a lantern. Its flame licked dangerously close to the bell ropes. You stay back, she screamed. Everyone stopped. Agnes laughed then, a cracked, frantic sound. Oh, you stupid people, she hissed. You think I'm going to prison at my age after all this? Agnes, Elinor said carefully, inching forward, put the gun down. No, you can still walk away from this. No, Agnes shrieked, tears suddenly streaming down her cheeks. My brother died in a hole while they drank tea and played respectable gentlemen. My whole life I waited for justice, and none came, so I made my own. Her hand shook violently now. The lantern flame flickered. Thomas whispered, Elinor, one more step, Agnes hissed, and I burn this tower with all of us inside. Silence, only wind, only the bell chain groaning. Elinor stared at her, saw the madness, the grief, the rage of 15 years curdled into obsession. And then very softly Elinor said, You loved him. Agnes froze, tears spilled faster. He was all I had. I know, you do, Agnes screamed. My father was taken from me too, Elinor said, voice trembling. I know exactly what that feels like. Agnes stared at her. Her lip quivered, the gun wavered, and for one tiny second her attention slipped. Thomas moved. He lunged across the floor. Agnes gasped. The lantern flew. The flame shattered across wood. Fire exploded upward in an instant. Margaret screamed. The old dry floorboards ignited like paper. Smoke billowed. The bell ropes caught fire. Move, Thomas shouted. Agnes shrieked as flames roared around them, the burning rope snapping overhead, and the great church bell suddenly dropped loose. Elinor looked up just in time. The massive bronze bell came crashing down toward them, and the floor beneath their feet split open. The world shattered in noise. Wood screamed. Metal thundered. Glass burst in glittering showers as the great bell smashed through the burning floorboards like a cannonball from heaven. Elinor felt the ground vanish beneath her. Someone screamed, perhaps her, perhaps Margaret, and then she was falling, tumbling through smoke and splinters and firelight into darkness below. She hit hard. the breath blasted from her lungs. For one sickening second she lay stunned amid broken pew wood and raining embers, unable to hear anything but a high, shrill ringing in her skull. Then pain returned all at once. "Eleanor," Thomas's voice roared somewhere nearby. "I'm here," she coughed, choking on smoke. Church nave had become chaos. The bell had crashed through the ceiling and floor alike, smashing into the aisle below amid shattered timber and stone. Flames raced hungrily up curtains and ancient woodwork, spreading terrifyingly fast. Smoke churned thick and black toward the rafters. Margaret was sobbing somewhere to Eleanor's left. "My Harris on fire, my Harris on fire. Pat it out," Wilkes bellowed. "I am patting it." Thomas stumbled through smoke and dropped beside Eleanor, grabbing her shoulders. "Are you hurt?" "I know, I think," she coughed violently. "Where's Agnes?" They all looked. At first Eleanor couldn't see her. Then a hand, pinned beneath fallen beams near the smashed bell. Agnes. She lay trapped, half buried in wreckage, blood streaking her forehead, her face twisted in agony as flames crawled ever closer around her. "Help me," she screamed. "Please, please help me." Margaret froze. "Oh God." Thomas looked toward the growing fire, then back to Eleanor. "We don't have time. Help me." Agnes shrieked again, sobbing now. "Please." Eleanor stared at her, at the woman who had manipulated half the village. Blackmailed, murderers, killed, lied, tried to murder them all, and still she could not leave her there. "Thomas," Eleanor said. He groaned instantly. "Of course that's what you're going to say." Together they rushed toward Agnes. The heat was already unbearable. Thomas grabbed one beam while Eleanor seized another. "Lift," they strained. Wood shifted, but barely. Agnes screamed in pain. "Again," Eleanor cried. Smoke burned their eyes, their lungs, their skin. They lifted harder. The beam gave suddenly. Thomas hauled Agnes free and practically dragged her across the floor as part of the ceiling collapsed behind them in a shower of sparks. "Out!" Wilkes shouted. They staggered through smoke toward the doors, half carrying, half dragging Agnes while the church groaned around them like a dying beast. And then they burst outside into cold night air. Everyone collapsed onto the grass, coughing violently. Villagers came running from every direction, shrieking as they watched flames consume the church tower. The entire bell chamber burned bright against the sky, sparks spiraling upward into darkness. Mrs. Dobson fainted. Again, someone yelled for buckets, someone else for water. Several simply stood gawking. Agnes lay on the grass wheezing, wrists bruised, hair wild, staring up at the burning tower with tears running down her face. Then she began to laugh, softly at first, then harder, wildly. Utterly unhinged. "It's gone," she whispered through giggles. "All of it gone at last." Wilkes stared at her in horror. "Right, definitely mad." Agnes looked at Eleanor, tears and soot streaking her face. "You should have left me," she whispered. Eleanor, shaking and filthy and exhausted beyond reason, stared back. "Perhaps." Agnes smiled faintly. "Still too kind for your own good." And then she closed her eyes. The next morning Blackthorn Hollow awoke to church bells no more. The tower had collapsed entirely before dawn. Nothing remained but blackened stone and smoking rubble. Agnes Ashcombe was arrested at sunrise and carted away muttering to herself in chains, laughing occasionally and asking whether Rupert would be pleased. And at last, at long last, the truth of Blackthorn Hollow was complete. Rupert Ashcombe murdered, Henry Whitmore betrayed, Crow corrupted, Bellamy disgraced, Gregory broken by guilt, Agnes consumed by revenge. The whole terrible history dragged into daylight where nothing could hide anymore. Months passed. Winter settled over the village. Snow softened rooftops. Smoke curled from chimneys. Children played where scandal once buzzed. And though the scars remained, life slowly resumed. The church would be rebuilt, the square restored. The gossip, naturally, never ceased. One quiet December evening, Eleanor stood outside her home watching snow drift lazily through golden lamplight when Thomas appeared beside her, hands tucked in his coat. "Thinking?" he asked. "Always." He smiled faintly. "Dangerous habit." She leaned against him. For a while neither spoke. Then Eleanor said softly, "Do you think it's over?" Thomas considered, then laughed quietly. "In this village," she smiled. "No," he admitted. "Absolutely not." As if summoned by the words, a scream split the night. Both froze, then came shouting from down the lane, and Margaret's voice shrill with panic. "Eleanor, Thomas, come quickly." They turned and ran. Snow flew beneath their boots. Margaret stood outside Miss Hartley's cottage white as a ghost, pointing frantically at the front garden. Miss Hartley herself stood in the doorway clutching her chest, speechless. and there, half buried in fresh snow beneath the rose bushes, lay the village postmaster, stone dead, with an icicle driven straight through his throat. Thomas stopped dead. "Oh, for God's sake." Margaret looked near tears. "It's happening again." Eleanor stared at the body, heart pounding. Then slowly, very slowly, she crouched. And beside the corpse, written neatly in the snow in black ink, were 4 chilling words: "This is only the beginning." For one terrible moment no one spoke. Snow drifted silently through the lantern light, soft and white and innocent, settling upon the dead man's coat and the hedges and the black, wet shine of blood spreading beneath him, while Eleanor crouched frozen in the cold, staring at the words written beside the body. "This is only the beginning," Thomas whispered beside her, his breath fogging in the night air. "No." Margaret made a strangled sound behind them. "No, no, no, absolutely not. I forbid more beginnings." Miss Hartley swayed in her doorway and had to grab the frame to steady herself. "That's Mr. Potts," she whispered faintly. "Dear Lord, that's Mr. Potts." Indeed it was. Mr. Leonard Potts, Blackthorn Hollow's cheerful postmaster, lay sprawled beneath the rose bushes with his spectacles askew and an icicle, an actual sharpened icicle, absurd and ghastly, driven through his throat. Thomas stared in utter disbelief. "Who murders a man with winter weather?" "Someone theatrical," Eleanor murmured, eyes narrowing. Wilkes came puffing down the lane 30 seconds later, saw the body, and actually let out a noise that sounded suspiciously like a sob. "Oh, come on," he groaned to the heavens. "What did I do to deserve this village?" Eleanor ignored him. Her gaze had fixed on the writing in the snow, not scratched, not finger-drawn. Ink, black ink, neatly poured and lettered with care. She leaned closer. Thomas knelt beside her. "What is it?" "The handwriting." Her voice lowered. "It's not the same." "What?" She pointed. "The letters from Agnes, the notes in the tower, they were spidery, slanted. This is different, cleaner, more precise." Thomas stared. Margaret blinked. "So this is Agnes?" "No." Eleanor rose slowly, heart pounding harder now. "Which means either Agnes had an accomplice, or," Thomas whispered grimly, "someone else has decided they enjoy murdering people." A sharp cry interrupted them. Miss Hartley pointed trembling toward the hedge. "There's something else." Eleanor hurried over. Caught in the rose thorns hung a leather satchel, the postman's mailbag, torn open and spilling letters across the snow. Thomas bent to inspect it. "It's been searched." "Why would anyone kill the postmaster for letters?" Margaret asked, but Eleanor was already kneeling. Among the scattered envelopes one stood apart, cream paper, heavy stock, unstamped, addressed simply to resident. No name, no house, no sender. Eleanor stared, then opened it. Inside was a card, just one sentence. "One secret in every home, one lie in every heart." A chill swept through her so hard she physically shuddered. Thomas read over her shoulder, face paling. "What the devil does that mean?" Wilkes stared between corpse and note like a man about to resign from reality altogether. "Is this some lunatic?" "No," Eleanor whispered. "No, this is deliberate." Her eyes moved slowly over the gathered villagers, faces pale in lantern light. Fear spreading, whispers already beginning. Someone was not merely killing. Someone was performing. Someone wanted fear. And suddenly Eleanor understood something awful. "This isn't about Mr. Potts," she said quietly. Thomas frowned. "What?" She lifted the note. "This is for the village." The next morning Blackthorn Hollow descended into panic. Doors remained bolted. Curtains shut tight. No one left home alone. Even Mrs. Dobson refused to gossip unless indoors and with witnesses. The news spread like wildfire. The postmaster murdered. A threat left in the snow. A killer loose once more. Inspector Fenwick returned before noon and looked moments from a stroke when informed. "No," he said flatly. "No, impossible. We just finished a murderer. We cannot have another. I forbid it." Wilkes blinked. "I'm not sure murder listens to being forbidden, sir." By afternoon, every home in the village received a hand-delivered notice from Fenwick instructing residents to report suspicious behavior, remain indoors after dusk, and lock windows. By evening, the first secret emerged. Mrs. Dobson's husband was discovered attempting to flee town after it came out. He had maintained a mistress in Market Weatherby for 6 years. By nightfall, a second. The butcher's son confessed he had stolen from the till for months. The next day, Miss Cartwright was exposed for forging references to secure her teaching post. And then another, and another. Every morning, fresh anonymous notes appeared beneath doors, revealing secrets, petty sins, scandals, affairs, thefts, lies. The village began turning on itself. People screamed in streets, families fought openly, doors slammed, friendships shattered overnight, and beneath it all loomed the terror: who knew all this, and who would kill next. 3 nights later, Alina sat at her kitchen table surrounded by notes, letters, and cold tea while Thomas paced. "This is madness," he muttered. "Absolute madness." "It's a campaign," Alina said quietly. Margaret looked up from her chair. "What?" Alina spread the notes before them. "The killer isn't just murdering, they're destabilizing the village, creating fear, distrust, chaos." Thomas frowned. "Why? To punish them perhaps, or to expose them?" Margaret swallowed. "For what?" Alina stared at the newest note. "One secret in every home, one lie in every heart." Then her eyes widened. "No," she whispered. Thomas turned. "What?" "The letters." She leapt up suddenly. "Alina, the post," she cried. "Mr. Potts." Margaret blinked. "Yes, he's dead. We covered that." "No, the post office." Alina grabbed her coat. "He handled everyone's mail, everyone's private correspondence. Their bills, letters, legal notices, love letters, everything." Thomas stopped pacing. Realization dawned. He knew everyone's secrets, he breathed, and someone wanted access to them. They ran. The post office sat dark and shuttered in the square, guarded only by one sleepy constable whom Alina brushed past before he could object. Inside, letters lay stacked everywhere: shelves, bags, sorting bins. Thomas whispered, "Where do we even begin?" Alina moved straight to Potts's desk, opened drawers, sorted papers, then stopped. There, a ledger. She opened it. Inside, meticulous notes. Not just postal records, observations, personal ones. Mrs. Dobson letter from cousin weekly, handwriting mail. Mr. Finch debt notices hidden from wife. Hartley receives legal correspondence under maiden name. Margaret gasped. He was spying. Thomas stared. Good God, Potts had been cataloging the private business of half the village. Then Alina's stomach dropped. There on the final page, one line was circled. Miss Alina Whitmore, letter received last Tuesday. Sender withheld. Strange wax seal, never delivered. She stared. What? Thomas stepped closer. A letter for you. I never got it. Where is it? Alina turned pages frantically. Gone, removed. Someone had taken it. Then the front door creaked. All three froze. A voice behind them said pleasantly, "Looking for something?" They spun. Standing in the doorway was Reverend Pike. Kind, timid Reverend Pike. Snow dusted his shoulders. His spectacles gleamed in the dim light, and in his hand he held a pistol. Margaret made a tiny choking scream. Why is it always someone nice? Thomas stepped in front of Alina. Reverend, Pike sighed heavily. Honestly, Miss Whitmore, you simply cannot stop yourself, can you? Alina stared in disbelief. You killed Mr. Potts. Pike gave a sad little smile. He was a loathsome man. Silence. You, Thomas whispered. You're behind this. Pike straightened slightly, and for the first time the timid softness dropped from him completely. His whole demeanor changed. No stammer, no nervousness, no meekness, only cold intelligence. Yes, he said calmly, though I confess I'd hoped to continue longer before you caught on. Alina stared. Why? He tilted his head. Because this village is rot. Snow blew in behind him. His eyes glinted strangely. I listened to confessions for 10 years, Miss Whitmore. I heard everything. His voice darkened. Adultery, theft, cruelty, abuse. Lies whispered every week by smiling hypocrites who then walked into church pretending virtue. He gestured sharply. And then came Crow, Agnes, Gregory, murder buried beneath Sunday hymns. His lip curled. This village is filth dressed in lace. Thomas whispered, horrified. So you're punishing them. I am cleansing them. Margaret whimpered. Oh dear God. Pike smiled faintly. Mr. Potts was useful at first. His records gave me everyone's secrets, but then he tried blackmailing me. A shrug. So I made an example of him. Alina's heart pounded. And me, the stolen letter? Pike's smile widened. That, he said softly, was from your mother. The room seemed to stop. My mother, a letter written before her death, intended for you. Potts intercepted it. I found it in his records. Pike's eyes gleamed. Would you like to know what it said? Alina's whole body trembled. Where is it? He tapped his coat pocket. Safe with me. Thomas snarled. Give it here. Pike lifted the gun. No. Silence, then he said softly, Come to St. Bartholomew's crypt at midnight, Miss Whitmore. Alone, he smiled. And perhaps I'll let you read your mother's final confession. Then he backed into the snow, vanished. Thomas shouted and ran after him, but outside the lane stood empty. Only drifting snow, only darkness, only silence. Thomas returned breathing hard. Gone. Margaret looked near collapse. There's a crypt now. Eleanor stood motionless, her mother's letter, her final words. Thomas touched her arm gently. Eleanor, she looked up, eyes burning, voice trembling. We're going. Midnight came cold and windless, and beneath St. Bartholomew's ancient chapel, hidden under cracked stone and candlelight, something was already waiting for them in the crypt, something hanging from the ceiling, turning slowly in the dark. For one terrible heartbeat, no one moved. The lantern in Thomas's hand flickered wildly, throwing long, trembling shadows across the crypt walls, and Eleanor stood frozen at the foot of the narrow stone steps, staring into the darkness below where something pale swayed gently from the ceiling. Margaret made a small strangled sound. No, Wilkes whispered. Sweet Lord preserve us. The thing turned slowly, and Eleanor's stomach dropped. It was a man. Hanging by the wrists from an iron hook bolted into the ancient stone ceiling, head slumped forward, shirt torn and soaked in blood. Reverend Pike. Thomas nearly dropped the lantern. What? Pike groaned, still alive. Oh, thank God, Margaret gasped, then immediately added, though still horrifying. Eleanor rushed forward. Pike, his head lifted weakly. His face was bruised, one eye swollen shut, blood running from his mouth. You, he rasped. You came. Thomas stared in disbelief. Who did this to you? Pike coughed violently, choking on blood, then laughed, a broken, desperate sound. Oh, I thought I was clever, he whispered. Thought I was hunting sinners. His good eye lifted, and for the first time Eleanor saw true terror there. He found me. A voice drifted from deeper in the crypt. No, Reverend, soft male, calm, you found me. Every spine snapped rigid. A figure stepped from the shadows beyond the stone tombs, tall, broad-shouldered, elegant in a dark overcoat. Face half hidden beneath the brim of a hat. Eleanor's breath caught. Impossible. No, no, he stepped fully into the lantern light, and Thomas made a sound like someone had punched him in the stomach. No, he whispered. The man smiled faintly. Hello, son. Silence shattered. Thomas Bellamy stumbled backward as though struck. No, his father stood before them. Edward Bellamy, supposedly dead for nearly a year, buried, mourned, gone, yet there he stood, older, thinner perhaps, but unmistakably alive. Margaret let out an outright scream. Wilkes dropped his truncheon. Thomas stared like a man seeing a ghost. You're dead, Edward smiled sadly. That was rather the point. No, Thomas whispered. No, I buried you. I saw a coffin, yes, empty, I'm afraid. The crypt seemed to tilt beneath Eleanor's feet. Thomas's father alive, the last conspirator, the final founder, the fourth. Eleanor whispered, you faked your death. Edward nodded. Crow arranged it beautifully. Thomas shook violently now. Why? Edward stepped closer, expression calm, almost weary. Because Crow and I knew Gregory was losing his nerve. Knew Agnes was becoming troublesome. The old arrangement was rotting. He spread his hands. So I removed myself from sight. And let your son grieve you, Thomas choked. Edward's face tightened slightly. Collateral pain. Thomas stared at him with naked horror. Pike whimpered from above. He knew what I was doing. He found my notes. He said my little game amused him. He began shaking. Then he took over. Edward smiled mildly. The Reverend lacked vision. He thought exposing affairs and petty thefts constituted justice. Childish. His eyes shifted to Eleanor. I had grander ambitions. Eleanor's blood ran cold. You killed Mr. Potts. Yes, and everyone else. Crow, Agnes, Gregory, yes, through various means and manipulations. He shrugged. Loose ends required tidying. Thomas looked physically ill. You used Pike, quite usefully. Edward nodded toward the hanging man. Until he bored me, Pike sobbed weakly. Eleanor stared in disbelief. You orchestrated all of this. Edward's smile sharpened. My dear, I orchestrated nearly everything from the beginning. Silence. He took another step forward. That night 15 years ago, Ashcombe died in panic. Crow struck him too hard during our confrontation. Henry saw. Gregory panicked. Everyone panicked. Edward's gaze darkened. I took charge. I always took charge. Thomas whispered. You had Henry attacked. He would have ruined everything. You helped bury Ashcombe. Yes, you let Crow take the blame, because Edmund was always easier to hate. Edward smiled faintly. Handsome men with arrogance make wonderful villains. Eleanor's stomach twisted. And my mother, she whispered. Edward paused, then his smile faded. Your mother, he said softly, was unfortunate. Ice flooded Eleanor's veins. What did you do? He sighed almost regretfully. She discovered Henry was alive before she died. Planned to tell you everything. His expression hardened. I could not permit that. Elinor stared. No, no, he smiled sadly. Her carriage accident was most tragic. A sound tore from Elinor's throat. Not words, something animal. You murdered her. Edward gave no answer. He didn't need to. Thomas whispered in horror. Mother of God, my father. Elinor's voice broke. My mother, Gregory, Crow, Agnes, Potts. Edward inclined his head. All unfortunate necessities. Silence. Then Thomas stepped forward, hands shaking. You killed my mother too, didn't you? Edward blinked. Thomas's face twisted with fury. She knew you weren't sick. She questioned your death arrangements. She started asking too much. Edward said nothing, and Thomas's face collapsed. Oh God, he whispered. Edward smiled sadly. Your mother was weak, Thomas, like Henry. Thomas lunged with a roar. They collided brutally. The lantern crashed from Thomas's hand and shattered darkness swallowed the crypt. Margaret screamed. Wilkes shouted. Pike shrieked overhead. All became chaos. Punches, grunts, stone scraping, bodies crashing. Elinor groped blindly through blackness. Then her hand touched something cold. Metal, the fallen lantern base. No flame, but beside it, a rusted ceremonial sword mounted from some ancient church display. She seized it. Thomas, she screamed. Edward's voice roared from darkness. You stupid boy, then Elinor swung. The blade struck flesh. A scream tore through the crypt. A body collapsed. Silence, heavy, absolute. Margaret sobbed somewhere in darkness. Who is it? Who is it? Then Thomas's voice gasping. Light someone, light. Wilkes fumbled desperately, relighting a wall candle with shaking hands. Flame bloomed, and the scene emerged. Thomas knelt on the floor bloody but alive. Edward Bellamy lay beside him, the sword buried deep in his side, blood spreading black across the stone. Elinor stood trembling, sword still in hand, horror washing over her. Edward coughed wetly. Looked up at her, then astonishingly laughed softly. Well, he whispered bloodily. There's Bellamy's spirit after all. Thomas stared down at him, shaking with tears. Why? Edward's eyes shifted to his son, and for the first time ever he looked almost human, almost sorry. Because power, he whispered, feels too good once tasted. Blood bubbled at his lips. He coughed again, then smiled faintly, and died. Silence swallowed the crypt. Only Pike's broken sobbing remained, only Margaret crying openly. Only Thomas kneeling over his father's corpse like a shattered statue. Elinor dropped the sword with a clatter, and then she noticed something. A leather envelope protruding from Edward's coat. Her breath caught. She reached slowly, pulled it free, her mother's handwriting. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely open it. Inside, one final letter. She unfolded it and read, My dearest Elinor, if you are reading this, then I have failed to protect you from the truth. Tears blurred instantly. She read on aloud in a shaking whisper while the crypt listened. Your father lived. I kept his secret because I feared the men who hunted him. I hated myself for every lie I told you. I hoped one day to reunite you, but if I am gone, then know this above all else. Everything I did, every terrible choice, was because I loved you more than truth, more than fear, more than my own soul. Forgive me if you can, and trust no Bellamy. There is darkness in that family deeper than anyone knows. Elinor stopped. Silence. Everyone slowly turned toward Thomas. Thomas stared, pale as death. What? Elinor's heart hammered. She looked again at the next line, and the blood drained from her face, because beneath that sentence her mother had written, Edward's son is not who he believes himself to be. Ask him about Rosewood House. Ask what happened the night he was born. No one in the crypt moved. The candle flame crackled weakly in its iron bracket, throwing shadows across stone and blood and the corpse at Thomas's knees, while Elinor stared down at the letter in her trembling hands and felt the world tilt once again beneath her feet. Thomas blinked at her, then at the page, then laughed once, sharp, hollow, utterly disbelieving. No, Margaret whispered. What does that mean? I don't know, Elinor said faintly. Thomas stood abruptly. No, he shook his head harder. No, absolutely not. I refuse another family revelation tonight. We've reached capacity. His voice cracked on the last word. No one laughed. Elinor swallowed. Thomas, he backed away from them all, pale and shaking. No, my father is dead on the floor. I've just learned he was a murderer, and now your mother apparently wishes to imply I'm some kind of mystery infant. He let out a near hysterical laugh. No, no more secrets tonight. Pike, still hanging weakly from the ceiling, gave a faint croak. Rosewood House. Everyone turned. Pike's one good eye fluttered open. Rosewood House was the old maternity home, he swallowed painfully. Burned down 28 years ago. Thomas froze. Elinor looked at him slowly. How old are you? His voice came out small. 28. Silence crashed over them. Margaret whispered, "Oh dear God." Thomas stared blankly. "No." Elinor folded the letter carefully, pulse racing. "Thomas. Did your mother ever speak of your birth?" "No." He frowned faintly. "Only that it was difficult. She hated discussing it." Pike coughed bloodily. "There were rumors after the fire." He swallowed. "Babies mixed up, records lost." Thomas's face emptied of all color. "No," he whispered. Elinor looked down at the letter again. "There's more." Everyone fell silent. She continued reading. "The Bellamys took in a child after the Rosewood fire. They told the village he was their own to preserve appearances, for Mrs. Bellamy's infant was stillborn. Edward never meant the truth to emerge. If Thomas learns this, tell him he was loved by his mother every day despite the lie." Thomas stared as if struck. The crypt seemed utterly silent. Then very softly, "I'm adopted." Margaret blinked. "Technically, yes, but perhaps not the time to phrase it so clinically." Thomas sank slowly onto a tomb behind him, face blank with shock. "I'm not a Bellamy." Elinor's eyes returned to the final lines of the letter, and then her stomach clenched. "There's one more thing," she whispered. Thomas looked up weakly. "Please God, no." She read, "The child came from the Ashcombe estate servants. The mother died in childbirth. Edward took the infant before records could survive the fire." No one breathed. Thomas stared, then laughed, not happily, not sanely, a short, broken laugh of sheer disbelief. "Oh, wonderful," he whispered. "Wonderful. So not only am I not a Bellamy," he looked up, eyes wide, "I'm Rupert Ashcombe's nephew." Margaret put both hands over her face. "This village is insane." Pike groaned from above. "Could someone perhaps let me down before more genealogy occurs?" That bizarrely broke the tension. Margaret barked a startled laugh through tears. Wilkes made a strangled noise. Even Elinor nearly choked. And Thomas laughed harder until it cracked into something halfway to sobbing. They cut Pike down. By dawn, the final scandal of Blackthorn Hollow had broken like thunder. Edward Bellamy, mastermind, murderer, manipulator, was exposed. Pike's crimes uncovered. Rosewood House's records investigated. And within days it was confirmed. Thomas Bellamy was no Bellamy at all. He had been born Thomas Ashcombe. The revelation tore through the village like wildfire. Mrs. Dobson reportedly fainted so dramatically she knocked over an entire tea cart. Mrs. Penworthy, upon hearing from prison, laughed until she had to be restrained. Inspector Fenwick simply sat at his desk muttering "of course" repeatedly into his hands. For Thomas, however, the revelation struck deeper than gossip. 3 nights later, Elinor found him sitting alone outside the frozen pond behind the Bellamy house, staring at the ice. He didn't turn as she approached. "I don't know who I am anymore," he said quietly. Elinor sat beside him. Snow crunched softly beneath her boots. "You're Thomas," she said simply. He gave a bitter smile. Apparently not even that certain. She touched his hand. He stared at it. "My whole life," he whispered, "I tried to be the son he wanted, to make him proud, to understand why he was so cold, why nothing I did mattered." He laughed hollowly. "Turns out he wasn't my father at all." Elinor's heart broke for him. "He raised you," she said softly, "but he did not make you." Thomas swallowed hard. "You're nothing like him." His eyes filled with tears. "You swear?" She squeezed his hand. "With my life." He looked at her for a long moment, then leaned forward and kissed her softly. Not desperate like before, not frantic, just quiet, gentle, real. And when they parted, he whispered, "Well, at least I know we aren't secretly cousins now." Elinor stared, then burst into helpless laughter. "Oh my God," he grinned weakly. "I had to ask myself. You idiot." Winter passed, then spring. And for the first time in many months, Blackthorn Hollow knew peace. No murders, no notes, no hidden conspiracies, no collapsing buildings. The church was rebuilt, the bell tower restored. Miss Hartley became local legend for the shovel incident. Constable Wilkes finally stopped looking permanently terrified. Thomas moved from the Bellamy estate into a smaller cottage near Elinor's. Margaret pretended not to notice how often he stayed late. And one bright May morning, Thomas proposed. Poorly. Very poorly. He was attempting to help Elinor in her garden when he tripped over a watering can, fell directly into the rose bushes, cursed loudly, then in trying to stand produced a ring box from his pocket entirely by accident. Margaret, watching from the window, screamed so loudly the neighbors heard. Elinor laughed until she cried, then said yes, of course. And for one beautiful fleeting moment, it seemed perhaps life might finally be simple. Until on the morning of the wedding, as bells rang bright over the square and guests gathered in flowers and hats and laughter, Mrs. Dobson came shrieking down the road in tears. "Stop the ceremony." Everyone turned. She stumbled breathless into the square, wild-eyed and pale. "There's a body," she screamed. Silence. Thomas slowly closed his eyes. "No," he whispered to the heavens. "Please." Mrs. Dobson pointed frantically toward the fountain. "There's a body in the fountain." The whole square erupted. Alina and Thomas stared at each other in utter disbelief. Then together, "Oh, for God's sake." They ran, and there, floating face down in the village fountain beneath flower petals and wedding ribbons, was the local magistrate, dead, with a wedding invitation pinned to his back in blood, and written across it in elegant black ink, "Death is patient." Did you really think it was over? For 3 full seconds, no one moved. The bells kept ringing above them, bright, cheerful, ridiculous, while the entire wedding party stood frozen around the fountain in stunned silence, flowers trembling in people's hands, hats askew, ribbons fluttering in the spring breeze, and poor Mrs. Dobson, having once again delivered catastrophic news, promptly fainted into the begonias. Thomas stared at the floating corpse, then at Alina, then back at the corpse. Still dressed in his wedding waistcoat and boutonniere, he whispered in a tone of utter spiritual defeat, "No." Margaret clutched her veil. "No, absolutely not. The universe cannot do this today." Wilkes, elbowing through the crowd in his formal uniform, took one look and nearly began crying. "Not on the wedding, not on the blessed wedding." Inspector Fenwick, invited reluctantly for propriety's sake, removed his spectacles and polished them with the exhausted air of a man who no longer believed in God. "Why," he whispered into the morning air, "do corpses flock specifically to this village?" Alina stepped forward. The magistrate, Mr. Harold Pembroke, pompous and generally disliked by everyone, floated limp in the fountain water, face pale beneath the rippling surface. The invitation pinned to his coat was smeared in scarlet. Thomas muttered, "Please tell me someone simply murdered an unpleasant man, and not that we have another dramatic serial lunatic." Alina reached carefully, took the bloodied invitation and unfolded it. Inside, written in immaculate black script, "Marriage joins bloodlines. Bloodlines carry sins. Ask the bride what she hasn't told him." Silence. Every single eye turned toward Alina. Margaret gasped so loudly she hiccuped. Thomas blinked. "What?" Alina stared at the card, her stomach dropping. "I don't know what that means." "Neither do I," Thomas said sharply, looking around at everyone. "But if anyone accuses my fiancée of murder before breakfast, I shall become extremely unreasonable." Fenwick snatched the note. Inside, everyone inside, nobody panic. Mrs. Dobson, still on the ground, whispered weakly, "Too late." An hour later, the wedding guests sat crammed miserably into the village hall while the magistrate's corpse was hauled away and statements were taken. The cake sat untouched. The flowers drooped. Someone had put the string quartet in a side room because their cheerful music had become unsettling. Thomas paced furiously. "This is insane," he muttered. "Utterly insane. Who kills a magistrate to interrupt a wedding?" "A person with flair," Margaret offered. "No flair," Thomas snapped. "I'm tired of flair." Alina sat rigid in a chair, staring at the note over and over. "Ask the bride what she hasn't told him." She hadn't told him anything, had she? Her mind raced. Then suddenly she froze. "No, no, surely not." Thomas saw her face change instantly. "What?" She stood slowly. "There is one thing." Margaret's jaw dropped. "Ella," Thomas blinked. "One thing," Alina swallowed. "It may be nothing." Thomas stared. "That phrase has never once in history preceded something comforting." She looked away. "After my father died, my second father, I suppose, Henry told me something else before he lost consciousness." Thomas frowned. "You never mentioned that." "I know." His expression tightened. "Alina," she swallowed, "because I didn't understand it then. I barely understand it now." "Tell me." Her voice dropped. "He said, 'You are not Henry's daughter.'" The room exploded. Margaret screamed. Wilkes dropped his notebook. Fenwick actually shouted, "Oh, for Christ's sake." Thomas stared at Alina blankly. "What? I thought he was delirious," she cried. "He was bleeding and dying and saying impossible things. I assumed he was confused." Margaret shrieked, "Why do none of you ever share important information?" Thomas ran both hands through his hair violently. "You're telling me today, on our wedding day, that your father's dying words may have been that you are not biologically related to him?" "Yes." Silence. Then Margaret whispered faintly, "This village is cursed." Thomas stared at Alina for a long time, then said slowly, "Well, that complicates things significantly." Fenwick rubbed his temples. "I require stronger alcohol than exists in England." Alina stood. "There's only one person who might know." Everyone turned. "My Aunt Judith." Judith Pembroke, her mother's elder sister, stern and formidable and famous for treating everyone as though they were mildly disappointing, lived 2 cottages over and had attended the wedding that morning. They found her trying to sneak out the back of the hall. "Aunt Judith," Alina called. Judith froze, very slowly turned. And the moment Alina saw her face, she knew. Judith looked terrified. "Judith," Alina whispered, "tell me the truth." The older woman's lips trembled. Then in a whisper, "Oh God," Thomas muttered, "that's never good." Judith sat heavily in a chair, hands shaking, then looked at Alina with tears in her eyes. "Your mother swore she'd take it to the grave." "Take what?" Alina whispered. Judith wept openly now. "You were Henry's." Silence. Alina felt the floor vanish beneath her. "Who?" she whispered. Judith closed her eyes and said the one name Alina least expected, Rupert Ashcombe. The room seemed to physically spin. No one breathed. Margaret's mouth fell open so wide she looked dislocated. Thomas whispered, "What?" Alina could barely speak. "No," Judith nodded miserably. "Before your mother married Henry, before everything, she had an affair with Ashcombe during his visits to the village. She became pregnant. Henry loved her so much he married her anyway and claimed you as his own." The blood roared in Alina's ears. "No, he raised you as his daughter from birth, loved you more than life." Judith sobbed. "And when Ashcombe vanished, Henry swore no one must ever know." Thomas stared at Alina with absolute disbelief, then blinked again, then suddenly burst out laughing. Everyone turned to him. It was not happy laughter. It was the laughter of a man being crushed by the universe. "Oh, splendid," he wheezed. "Splendid." "Because if Rupert Ashcombe was your father," Margaret's eyes widened in horror. "No," she whispered. Thomas pointed at himself. "And I am Rupert Ashcombe's nephew." Everyone froze. Thomas and Alina stared at each other. Utter silence. Margaret screamed. "Are you cousins?" Chaos exploded. "No, no, 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 that can't be right. Wait, nephew through sibling. How close is that genetically?" "Stop saying genetically." Fenwick shouted. "Silence." Everyone stopped, panting. Judith, still crying, blinked. No. No, Rupert was not Thomas's uncle by blood. All heads snapped toward her. "What?" Alina and Thomas said together. Judith wiped tears. "Rupert Ashcombe was adopted into that family as a boy. His sister Agnes was his adoptive sister only." Silence. Thomas stared blankly, then whispered, "We're not cousins." Margaret collapsed into a chair, sobbing with relief. "Thank God." Thomas immediately sank against the wall, laughing hysterically. "I nearly died." Alina pressed both hands to her face, then looked up sharply. "Wait, the magistrate." Everyone froze. The magistrate. Judith went pale. "Oh no." Alina stared at her. "What?" Judith whispered. "Harold Pembroke knew." Silence. "He discovered the affair years ago. He blackmailed your mother over it." Her face crumpled. "She paid him for decades to keep silent." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "So someone killed him because of that secret." Alina's mind raced. "Someone who knew the truth." "Someone close enough to know family history," Fenwick muttered. Wilkes whispered, "But who?" Then from the doorway came a voice, soft, female, calm. "I imagine I should answer that." Everyone turned. Standing there in wedding clothes, still holding her bouquet, was Margaret, and in her trembling hand a pistol. Alina stared. "No." Margaret's eyes brimmed with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Thomas blinked. "Margaret," Fenwick barked, "put that down." Margaret laughed shakily. "I really wish people would stop telling me what to do today." Alina stepped forward slowly, horrified. "Margaret, what are you doing?" Margaret's face twisted. "You all get revelations and secrets and drama and fathers returning from the dead and hidden letters and great romances and mysteries to solve." Her voice cracked. "And no one notices me. Ever." Silence. No one moved. Margaret cried openly now. "Do you know what it's like standing beside you all the time, Alina? Brilliant Alina, brave Alina, everyone's darling detective Alina." She laughed bitterly. "I was always the sister in the background, the nervous one, the silly one." Alina whispered, devastated. "Margaret, I found out the magistrate knew your secret." Margaret sobbed. "He was going to ruin the wedding, expose you in front of everyone." Her hands shook violently. "So I stopped him." Silence. Thomas whispered, "Oh my God." Margaret's voice broke. "I did it for you." Alina stared in horror. Margaret sobbed harder. I didn't mean for any of this. I just wanted one thing to be perfect for you, just once." Her finger trembled on the trigger, and outside, a second gunshot rang out. Margaret jerked violently. Blood blossomed across her dress. Everyone screamed. Margaret collapsed, and standing behind her in the doorway, smoke rising from his pistol, was Mrs. Penworthy's prison guard, who lowered the gun, smiled coldly, and said, "Agnes sends her regards." For one stunned heartbeat, no one in the room understood what had happened. Margaret collapsed like cut silk, her bouquet scattering roses across the floorboards as blood bloomed scarlet over white lace, and Eleanor's scream ripped from her so violently it left her throat raw. "No," she dropped to her knees beside her sister. Margaret's eyes fluttered wildly, mouth opening in a silent gasp as blood spilled between her fingers where she clutched her stomach. Thomas lunged toward the doorway, roaring with fury, but the prison guard, still smiling, smoke curling from the barrel of his pistol, fired again. The shot shattered a window beside Thomas's head. Glass exploded inward. Everyone ducked. "DOWN," Fenwick bellowed. Chaos erupted. Guests screamed. Chairs overturned. Someone fainted into the cake table. The guard bolted. Thomas sprinted after him. Wilkes stumbled after Thomas, shouting incoherently, but Eleanor heard none of it. She knelt in blood, hands pressed desperately over Margaret's wound. "No, no, 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 stay with me, Margaret, stay with me." Margaret coughed wetly, tears spilling down her cheeks. "It hurts, Ellie. I know, help is coming. Don't let me die in this dress," Margaret whimpered. "I look ridiculous, even then, even bleeding on the floor." "Still, Margaret." Eleanor let out a broken sob laugh. "You do not look ridiculous." Fenwick dropped beside them. "Pressure. Harder, keep pressure. Someone fetch Dr. Lambert now." Margaret grabbed Eleanor's wrist weakly, her face pale as milk. "I'm sorry." "Don't," Eleanor cried. "Don't you dare. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I know, I just wanted." Her lip trembled violently. "I just wanted to matter." Eleanor broke completely. "Oh God!" Margaret, outside, shouting rang through the square. Thomas's voice, Wilkes, then another gunshot, then silence. Margaret was rushed upstairs to the nearest room while Dr. Lambert, the new physician after Crow's death, nervous and perpetually sweating, worked frantically over her while Eleanor paced like a madwoman outside the door, hands covered in her sister's blood. Thomas came stumbling back 20 minutes later, bruised, panting. "He got away," he gasped. Eleanor turned sharply. "What?" Thomas bent double, catching breath. "The guard, he had a horse waiting beyond the square. I nearly had him, but..." He slammed a fist into the wall. "Damn it!" Fenwick stormed in behind him, furious. "We'll have every road watched. He won't leave the county." But Eleanor barely heard, because one phrase looped endlessly in her skull. "Agnes sends her regards. She ordered it from prison," Eleanor whispered. Thomas looked up grimly. "Seems so." "How?" Fenwick growled. "Then she had help inside." Hours later, Margaret survived surgery by sheer luck and stubbornness. The bullet had passed through her side. Painful, dangerous, but not fatal. When Dr. Lambert emerged at last to announce she would live, Eleanor collapsed into Thomas's arms, weeping so hard she could barely stand. And yet, even relief brought no peace, because Agnes Ashcombe, imprisoned miles away, had somehow reached beyond bars and walls and guards to strike again. And if she could do that, who else did she have? That night, long after the guests had fled and the wedding lay utterly ruined, Eleanor sat alone in Margaret's room while her sister slept pale and weak beneath blankets. Thomas entered quietly behind her. "She asked for you while delirious," he murmured, kept apologizing. Eleanor stared down at Margaret's sleeping face. "She nearly ruined everything." Thomas nodded, then softly, "She also nearly died trying to protect you in her own mad way." Eleanor swallowed hard. "I know." Silence lingered. Then Thomas sat beside her. "Fenwick has sent word to the prison. Agnes's entire staff is being questioned." Eleanor nodded faintly. Thomas hesitated, then gently, "Do you forgive her?" Eleanor looked at Margaret, at the bandages, the pale lashes, the sister who had envied her enough to kill for her, and whispered, "I don't know yet." The next morning news arrived. Agnes Ashcombe was dead. The message came just after dawn. Fenwick himself delivered it, face grim. "She hanged herself in her cell overnight." Silence. Thomas frowned. "Convenient." "Very," Fenwick muttered darkly, "but the guards swear it's genuine." Eleanor stood slowly. "And the one who shot Margaret?" "Gone, vanished." Fenwick's jaw clenched. "No record of the man even existing before 6 months ago. False name, false references." Thomas muttered, "Wonderful." but Eleanor's eyes narrowed. No, something felt wrong, deeply wrong. She didn't kill herself, Eleanor whispered. Fenwick frowned. What? She ordered the shooting, yes, but Agnes would never kill herself before knowing the result. Eleanor's voice sharpened. She was too proud, too obsessed. She'd want to savor it. Thomas stared. You think someone silenced her? Eleanor nodded slowly. Someone she could expose. A silence fell. Then Fenwick whispered, Dear God, if Agnes had accomplices, Eleanor murmured, and one feared she might speak. She was murdered, Thomas finished, which meant someone else remained, still. After all of it, still. 3 nights later, Eleanor and Thomas traveled under heavy rain to Agnes's prison cell. The warden, pale and sweating, led them down narrow corridors into the damp stone block where Agnes had died. There, he whispered. The cell stood empty, silent, cold. A noose still hung from the bars overhead, but Eleanor barely looked at it. She knelt instead by the cot, then frowned. What is it? Thomas asked. She pointed. A scratch in the stone floor. No, not scratch, writing. Faint. Made by fingernails, perhaps. She leaned closer. Read, and the blood drained from her face. Thomas crouched beside her. What? She whispered the words aloud. Not the guard, the wife. Silence. Thomas blinked. The wife? Fenwick frowned. Whose wife? And then all 3 froze. Eleanor slowly stood. No, she whispered. Thomas stared at her. No, they looked at each other, together, and said the same name. Mrs. Fenwick. Inspector Fenwick went white. What? Eleanor's heart hammered. Your wife. Stared in disbelief. My wife is in Bath with her sister. No, Eleanor said. That's what you said. We've never met her. No one has. Fenwick frowned. She dislikes travel. Thomas's eyes widened. The prison guard, he whispered. He had access because someone recommended him. Fenwick blinked, then his face slowly changed. My wife. Eleanor stepped closer. Who handled your appointments, your correspondence, your staffing recommendations? Fenwick stared blankly, then whispered, She did. Silence, everything clicked, all the access, all the knowledge, all the influence behind scenes. Agnes's secret helper, someone invisible, someone overlooked, a wife no one had ever met. Where is she really? Eleanor demanded. Fenwick swallowed. Our estate outside Weatherby. They rode there at once through rain and thunder. Fenwick's country house loomed grand and dark against the storm, windows glowing faintly. And standing in the upstairs window watching them arrive was a woman in black. She smiled. Then vanished. Move, Eleanor shouted. They burst through the doors. Servants screamed. Thunder shook the walls. Upstairs, down corridors, doors flying open until at last they found her in the study. Mrs. Beatrice Fenwick, elegant, beautiful, silver-haired, perfectly poised, sitting calmly by the fire with a revolver resting in her lap. She smiled faintly. Well, took longer than I hoped. Fenwick stared like a man seeing a stranger. Beatrice, she tilted her head. Harold, why? He whispered. She looked almost bored. Because Agnes was my mother. Silence. No one breathed. Fenwick staggered. What? Beatrice sighed. She abandoned me as a child, you see. Left me in London with relatives while she came here to play her revenge games. Years later I found her. Her eyes hardened. And learned what this village had done to our family. Thomas whispered. Ashcombe, she nodded. Rupert was my uncle. Eleanor's stomach twisted. She built her revenge for decades, Beatrice said softly. But she was sloppy, emotional, dramatic. Her lip curled. I improved the plan. You used her, Eleanor whispered. Yes, you manipulated all of it. Yes, Crow, Pike, Agnes, all disposable. Fenwick looked shattered. You married me for access, Beatrice smiled sadly. Among other conveniences, he made a broken sound. Eleanor stepped forward. You killed Agnes. Yes, you shot Margaret. A pity, wrong sister. Thomas snarled and lunged. Beatrice fired. The gunshot thundered. Thomas jerked and collapsed. Thomas! Everything exploded into screaming. Eleanor dove for him as Fenwick roared in grief and fury. Charging his wife, Beatrice fired again. The shot missed. Fenwick tackled her. The gun skidded. Eleanor grabbed Thomas. Thomas, Thomas, he groaned. Alive, blood soaking his shoulder. Oh, thank God! Across the room, Fenwick wrestled Beatrice desperately. Then with a scream she tore free and ran through the balcony doors into the storm. Everyone chased. Rain lashed violently. Wind screamed across the balcony. Beatrice stood at the edge laughing wildly, hair whipping around her face. It never ends, she screamed over thunder. Do you hear me? Never. Every lie breeds another. Every secret births blood. Fenwick sobbed. Beatrice, please. She smiled at him. Softly, almost lovingly, then stepped backward and vanished over the edge. Her scream disappeared into thunder. Silence. Rain poured, no one moved. Far below, only broken stone and stillness. Weeks later, Margaret healed slowly. Thomas recovered. Fenwick resigned entirely and moved away forever. The wedding, obviously, was postponed indefinitely, and one quiet summer night, Elinor finally stood once more beside Thomas beneath lantern light outside the rebuilt church. No bodies, no screams, no gunfire, just peace. Thomas looked at her carefully. "So," he murmured, "shall we perhaps attempt marriage again without homicide this time?" Elinor laughed softly, then froze. Thomas frowned. "What?" She stared at the church notice board, at a fresh white envelope pinned there. Her blood ran cold. "No," Thomas turned slowly. The envelope read, "To the happy couple." Hands trembling, Elinor opened it. Inside, a blank card. Only one sentence written in red: "You forgot about the child." For a moment the world seemed to go silent around them. The evening air, the rustle of leaves, the distant chatter from the square. All of it vanished beneath the thunder of Elinor's pulse in her ears as she stared down at the card in her trembling hand. "You forgot about the child." Thomas read it over her shoulder, then blinked, then frowned. "What child?" Elinor's voice came out in a whisper. "I don't know." Thomas took the card from her sharply, turning it over. Blank, no signature, no clue, just those 5 words. Margaret, walking toward them from across the lane with her arm still in a sling and carrying pastries, saw their faces and groaned instantly. "No," she said flatly, "no more notes. I can tell by your expressions there's another note. Burn it." Elinor handed it to her. Margaret read it, then blinked twice, then slowly whispered, "What child?" The next morning the three of them sat buried beneath old papers in Elinor's parlor while Thomas paced furiously between stacks of letters, records, and family trees. "This is absurd," he muttered. "We've had conspiracies, blackmail, murder, prison assassins, secret paternity, hidden adoption. What child have we forgotten?" Elinor stared at the card again. Forgotten, not unknown, forgot, which meant it had already been mentioned, somewhere, somehow, and then her eyes widened. "Oh my God." Thomas turned sharply. "What?" Elinor looked up, face pale. "The Rosewood fire," Margaret blinked. "The maternity home," Elinor nodded rapidly. "When we learned Thomas was taken after the fire, they said babies were mixed up, records lost." Thomas frowned. "Yes," she stared at him. "Plural." Silence. Margaret whispered, "Babies." Thomas stopped pacing slowly. "You think there was another child switched that night?" Elinor nodded. "Or hidden, or lost." Thomas stared at the floor, thinking fast. "But why would anyone care now? Unless that child matters. To who?" She looked at him, and both froze. "The Ashcombs," Thomas whispered. If another child had been taken or hidden from Rosewood House, and Thomas was secretly Ashcombe blood, then perhaps another heir existed. Another person tied to everything. Another secret buried in the same fire. They raced that afternoon to the county records office where dusty archives and ancient ledgers sat stacked in forgotten cabinets. A tired clerk sighed deeply when Elinor burst in demanding 28-year-old fire reports, maternity records, and adoption logs. Hours passed. Dust, paper, frustration. Then Margaret shouted suddenly, "Here!" They rushed over. A burned ledger recovered from Rosewood House. Half-charred, water-damaged, barely readable. Elinor turned pages carefully. Birth registry, night of fire, Mrs. Bellamy, male stillborn, unnamed servant girl. Male infant surviving Mrs. Clara Devens, female infant surviving unknown woman, male infant surviving, mother deceased upon delivery. Thomas frowned. 4 births. Elinor scanned further, then froze. Below it, scribbled hastily in later ink, only 2 infants accounted for after evacuation. Silence. Margaret whispered, "No." Thomas stared. 2 babies vanished. The room seemed to shrink around them. 2 infants unaccounted for. Thomas was one, which meant another child disappeared that night, another missing heir, another hidden person. Elinor whispered, "Someone took both." Thomas frowned, but Bellamy only raised one. Then where did the second go? The answer came not from the papers but from the doorway, a voice, soft, shaking. "I know." They turned. Miss Hartley stood there, pale as death, clutching her gloves. Margaret blinked. "How long have you been standing there?" "Long enough." Miss Hartley stepped inside, trembling. "I never meant to hear this, but," she swallowed. "I know about Rosewood." Elinor stared. "How?" Hartley's lips trembled. "Because I was there." Silence. "What?" Thomas whispered. Hartley lowered her eyes. "My mother was head nurse." Her voice shook. "I was 16, helping the night of the fire." Aliner's heart hammered. Tell us. Hartley sat heavily, hands trembling. There were 4 babies born that night. Then the fire started in the east wing. Panic everywhere. Smoke screaming, her eyes glazed with memory. People grabbing infants, running, shouting names. And she swallowed. A woman came through the smoke, hooded, richly dressed. I didn't know her name then. Aliner whispered, Agnes. Hartley nodded. She took one of the boys from my mother's arms and ran. My mother screamed after her, but the roof collapsed. Tears brimmed in Hartley's eyes. Then when we got outside, Edward Bellamy already held another infant. Thomas whispered, stunned, Agnes took a baby. Yes, why? Hartley looked at him. Because she said, the Ashcombe line will not die in this village. Silence thundered. Margaret whispered, she stole the second child. Thomas's face went white. She kept him, or her, raised in secret perhaps, prepared, hidden an heir, an Ashcombe. A chill crawled down Aliner's spine. Agnes had a child hidden all these years. Then the room door opened again, and Inspector Fenwick's former housemaid stumbled in breathless. Miss Whitmore, she gasped. You must come at once, there's been another note. Everyone groaned. No, Thomas snapped. No more notes. The maid held it out anyway. Aliner snatched it, read, and froze. What? Her voice barely worked. It says, she swallowed. You're looking in the wrong generation. Silence. Thomas blinked. What does that mean? Then Hartley gasped sharply. Oh my God. Everyone turned. Her face had gone white. The child, what? Hartley's eyes widened with horror. No, she whispered. No, no, no. Hartley, what? She stared at them, voice shaking. The baby Agnes took wasn't a boy. Silence. Everyone froze. Thomas frowned. What? Hartley swallowed hard. My mother corrected the ledger later. It was smudged. Agnes took the female infant. The room stopped. Female, not male, a girl. Aliner whispered, then where is she? Hartley looked at Aliner, and the blood drained from her face. Oh, Aliner stared back. Then suddenly no, 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 because Hartley was 28, raised by a nurse from Rosewood. Always in the village, always present, always nearby, Margaret whispered at first. No, Hartley burst into tears. Oh God, Thomas stared in disbelief. Violet, Hartley sobbed openly. My mother told me before she died I was never hers. Agnes paid her to keep me hidden. She said if anyone ever learned the truth they'd kill me. Aliner stared. Miss Hartley, Violet Hartley, the schoolmistress, the nervous spinster, always present, always overlooked, Ashcombe blood, the lost child. Hartley wept harder. I never knew until last year. I swear I never told anyone. Thomas staggered backward, laughing in disbelief. Of course it's Miss Hartley. Margaret clutched her head. Why is everyone secretly someone else? Hartley sobbed. Agnes visited me for years pretending to be my aunt. I only learned the truth when she was arrested. Aliner stared, then whispered, she wrote the note. Everyone froze. Hartley blinked. What? The church note. Aliner pointed. You forgot about the child. Her eyes widened. Agnes didn't write it. Then who? A slow clap echoed from the doorway. Everyone turned, and standing there smiling was Dr. Lambert, the physician, the sweating, nervous doctor, holding a pistol. Thomas groaned. No, no more doctors. Lambert smiled, his nervous stammer gone entirely. Well done, he said calmly. Took you longer than expected. Aliner stared in disbelief. You? Lambert inclined his head. Yes. Hartley whispered, horrified. Who are you? He smiled wider. The husband. Silence. Everyone blinked. The husband of whom? Thomas barked. Lambert sighed. Agnes's daughter, naturally. The room exploded. What? She had a daughter too. How many secret relatives are there? Lambert raised the gun impatiently. My wife died 5 years ago. Agnes was her mother. His eyes gleamed. And I promised her before she died I'd secure Violet's inheritance. Hartley stared blankly. My inheritance. The Ashcombe fortune, what remains of it. Lambert smiled. Agnes hid it before prison. Left clues only I know. He gestured to Hartley. And you, dear Violet, are the final legal heir. Aliner's blood ran cold. You're killing everyone to get to her. Precisely. Hartley whimpered. Lambert smiled at her. I had hoped to keep you docile longer, but Miss Whitmore does so ruin surprises. He raised the pistol, and before anyone could move, Hartley screamed and threw the nearest object, a brick-sized dictionary, straight into his face. Lambert yelped. Gun fired wildly, glass shattered. Thomas tackled him. Everyone screamed, and in the chaos, Lambert staggered backward straight into the lit fireplace. His coat caught instantly. He shrieked. Flames engulfed him. He stumbled wildly, screaming, crashing into curtains. Fire spread. Margaret shrieked. Oh, for God's sake, not again. Lambert ran burning into the street, still screaming, until he collapsed in the mud outside. Still, dead silence, only smoke, only panting. Then Thomas looked at Hartley, who still held the dictionary. He blinked, then whispered, "You killed him with literature." Hartley burst into hysterical sobbing. Months later, peace finally came. No more notes, no more killers. No more secret heirs. Violet Hartley inherited a hidden Ashcombe trust and retired happily. Margaret recovered and entered therapy. Fenwick moved abroad. Wilkes retired. And at long last, Alina and Thomas married quietly in autumn. No corpses, no blood, no screaming, just vows, flowers, peace. And that night, lying beside him at last in calm silence, Alina whispered, "Do you think it's finally over?" Thomas looked at her, then slowly smiled. And from downstairs, a scream echoed. Both stared upward, then together. "Oh, for God's sake." They leapt from bed and ran downstairs to find Margaret standing in the kitchen, white-faced, pointing at the pantry. Inside, something scratched from within, something large, something growling. Thomas blinked. Alina stared. Margaret whispered, "I think there's a tiger in your pantry." Margaret stood in the kitchen, trembling so violently she was nearly rattling her teeth. One hand clutched to her chest, the other pointing toward the pantry door, as if the very act of lowering her arm might somehow release whatever beast lurked within. "I swear on my life," she whispered, voice shrill with panic, "there is something in there with stripes." Thomas, still barefoot and half buttoning his nightshirt, stared at the pantry in utter disbelief. "There is not a tiger in our pantry." Low growl answered from behind the door. Everyone froze. Then another sound followed, a heavy scratching, a snort, something knocking over shelves. Margaret shrieked. It snorted. Alina slowly reached for the fireplace poker leaning by the stove. "Thomas," he swallowed hard. "Yes, if there is truly a tiger in our pantry. Yes, I would like it noted that after all we have endured, I shall find that personally insulting." The pantry door rattled violently. Thomas grabbed the nearest broom like a sword. "On three," Margaret squealed. "Why are we counting?" "One," Thomas barked. The growling intensified. "Two," something slammed against the wood. "Three," Thomas yanked the pantry door open, and all three screamed. Not because of a tiger, but because something orange and striped did indeed come bursting out of the darkness straight at Thomas's face. He shouted and swung the broom. Margaret fainted on the spot. Alina hit the thing with the poker and then stopped, because it was not a tiger. It was Mr. Dobson's enormous orange tabby cat, Marmalade. The beast hissed indignantly, leapt onto the table, knocked over a loaf of bread, and stared at them all as though they were the embarrassing ones. Silence. Then Thomas slowly lowered the broom. Margaret, half conscious on the floor, whispered faintly, "Is it gone?" Alina stared blankly at the cat. Thomas stared at the cat. Then both of them burst into helpless laughter. The kind of laughter born only from months of terror, trauma, absurdity, and exhaustion finally breaking at once. Margaret sat up blinking. "Why are you laughing? Is death funny now?" "There's no tiger," Alina gasped through tears of laughter. "Only Marmalade." Margaret looked, then screamed, "That devil cat again." Marmalade meowed smugly. And somehow, absurdly, beautifully, that was the moment Alina realized it truly was over. No secret killers, no hidden letters, no blood in fountains. No mysterious notes pinned in the dark, only life, ordinary, ridiculous life. The months that followed passed in peace at last. Blackthorn Hollow settled. Scandals faded into stories. Stories softened into gossip. And gossip in time became legend. The village rebuilt itself once more. The church bells rang every Sunday. Children played in the square. Miss Hartley, now unexpectedly wealthy, became insufferably proud and purchased far too many hats. Constable Wilkes retired happily and never investigated so much as a missing chicken again. Inspector Fenwick vanished to the seaside and was rumored never to speak the word village without shuddering. Margaret healed slowly, in body and spirit both. She apologized, truly apologized, for what she had done, and though forgiveness did not come overnight, Alina gave it in time. Because Margaret had always been foolish, always dramatic, always desperate to matter, but she had never stopped loving her sister, and Alina, despite everything, never stopped loving her back. As for Thomas, he remained exactly as maddening and charming and loyal as ever. And on crisp autumn evenings, When the lamps glowed golden across the village and mist rolled softly through the lanes, Alina would often find him waiting at the garden gate with that crooked smile of his and flowers clutched awkwardly in one hand, as if he still half expected her to refuse him. She never did. Years later, the people of Blackthorn Hollow would still tell stories of the strange season when death seemed to walk their streets every week, of Gregory Pym's scream in the bell tower, of Dr. Crow's fall, of Agnes Ashcombe's revenge, of Edward Bellamy's secrets, of the burning church, of the bride who solved murders in her wedding gown, of the schoolmistress who killed a man with a dictionary, and at the center of every tale always was Alina Whitmore, sharp-eyed Alina, fearless Alina, the woman who uncovered every lie buried beneath the pretty stone cottages and flower boxes of Blackthorn Hollow. Though Alina herself, when asked, would only ever sigh and say, "I merely wanted a quiet life," and Thomas would laugh beside her and reply, "Well, darling, you chose the wrong village." Then she would laugh too, and kiss him, and the world at last would feel warm. So if ever you find yourself passing through a little village where the bells ring sweetly, the tea is hot, the roses bloom bright, and every smiling face seems perhaps just a touch too polite, be careful, because beneath every perfect little cottage, behind every lace curtain, under every whispered greeting, there may be secrets waiting. And some secrets, no matter how deeply buried, always claw their way back into the light. Thank you for listening to this mystery until the very end. If you enjoyed this tale of secrets, suspense, and scandal in Blackthorn Hollow, be sure to subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments below, and tell me which twist shocked you the most. Until next time, sleep lightly. And trust no one after dark.